Chapter 980. After the storm, there was a touch of intoxicating blue under the dark sea. The sun passed through the dark clouds, and the sky behind them gradually became clear again. After the storm, there was only a thin drizzle left in the sky, shining with golden light under the sun. The drizzle fell on the mast of the fleet, washing away the scorch marks and bloodstains on the silver sails. The whole fleet floated above the sublime inland sea, full of scars, like a giant beast that had fallen into silence, telling the story of the battle that had just happened. The group of dragons was retreating like the tide. Modesty flapped her wings that covered the sun, and the clouds that were sucked into the vortex under her wings were torn apart like a torrent hitting a reef, turning into scattered flame fragments. She confronted the human fleet in midair, staring at them with hatred. Her golden pupils showed a look of resentment and unwillingness, but the shocking sword that split the storm in half a moment ago made her terrified. Supreme Sword Saint. There was actually a Supreme Sword Saint in this small human fleet. That black-clothed human man's cold eyes made her unable to summon up any will to resist. Damn it, if only that arrogant guy Obsidian was here, he would definitely teach them a lesson. The female black dragon gritted her teeth, but she had to admit defeat. She used her claws to signal her dragon general not to act rashly. Go retreat. They are going to Faust. Let's wait and see. We will meet again there. Modesty squeezed these words out of her teeth. As soon as she turned around, it was as if a dark cloud had moved away from the sky, and the shadow that shrouded the fleet was gone. The dragons had left. They are retreating, the crowd screamed. They could hardly believe that they had withstood the storm and defeated the attack of the dragons. It was almost a miracle, a miracle. Everyone understood that the biggest crisis had passed. Now the vast sea would be a smooth journey for them, and there would be no more obstacles. After the storm, the rainbow hanging in the sky was so clear. The people of Cruz who had participated in the previous battle could not help but shout and cry. The nobles, however, did not care about their dignity anymore. They walked to the deck one after another. Seeing this scene, their legs felt weak. They leaned on the mast and drew Martha's holy emblem, whispering praises for the blessing of the god. However, they hadn't forgotten who had created this miracle. Although they were extremely unwilling to admit that it was an Erewhon who had achieved all of this, from Vargas to Lone Harbor, and from Lone Harbor to the sublime inland sea, it was as if nothing could hinder the young man's confidence. They are, after all, that person's descendants. He's a descendant of the Highland Knight. The crowd whispered such words in low voices. More and more people gathered at the side of the ship and cheered loudly, celebrating this hard-won victory and hysterically venting their feelings. However, those who had truly participated in the preparation of this war could not think of anything else at this time. They only felt deeply exhausted, both physically and mentally. It was as if after suddenly relaxing, the fatigue and mental dispiritedness swept over them. Brando stood on the stern of the Akhenaten. At a glance, he saw the merchant lady in the crowd who had fallen asleep in Yuta's arms. Even in her sleep, the Roman still frowned slightly, as if she was still continuing her previous work. Seeing this scene, Brando could not help but feel his heart soften. In the past 40 hours, the entire fleet's countless supplies were uniformly allocated by the merchant lady alone. Nearly 2 days and 2 nights of continuous work. She did not have the slightest time to rest. But all of this was almost perfectly completed with the support of the merchant lady's extraordinary talent. Her terrifying memory and keen sense of the flow of supplies even amazed Brando. In the past, he rarely intervened in the business affairs of the Roman territory, nor did he see how this lady could command the wind and rain in her own territory. But at this moment, he understood why the business activities of the AB's territory could be so orderly from the beginning, even far surpassing its other industries. Brando, those monsters have attacked us more than the other side. There are 16 small boats and 4 large ships on the other side. Their consumption of magic crystals and ammunition should be much lower than expected. If the 27 ships on this side run out of ammunition, you can find a way to balance it from the other side. Also, the little Roman carefully reminded him with a pair of dark circles under her eyes. The ship that was hit was the Deer and 3 other ships. 2 of them fell into the sea. The ships that fell into the sea should be carrying food and drinking water, which is 1/3 of our supplies. I've already placed the remaining transport ships in the middle of the fleet. Brando, you have to be careful and protect them." After saying those words, she yawned, tilted her head and fell into a deep sleep in his arms. She even snored softly, as if she was not worried that Brendel would take advantage of her, which made Brendel smile bitterly. It was a pity that Brando wanted to give the merchant lady who had been following him wholeheartedly since Butchie a warm hug, but the fleet could not leave his command for even a moment. He could only cruelly leave the latter in Yuda's care. Thinking of the battle that had just ended, he felt a little lucky. It was a rare storm on the sublime sea. Lightning fell like a curtain from the dark clouds. However, the storm was not only a hindrance to the humans, but also to the attack of the draconic beasts. That was the reason why he pushed the fleet to deviate from their course and plunged into the dangerous storm. He knew that these dragons from the underground would not be able to adapt to the complex and changeable climate on the sea. Reality proved that his common sense in the game saved everyone once again. Modesty organized many attacks in the storm, but none of them worked. The dragons were not used to the stormy clouds, let alone launching an effective attack. Instead, some of them fell into the sea due to the loss of altitude. On the other hand, although the human fleet was slow, the sailors who were used to standing with the wind and waves could always effectively prevent the fleet from getting lost. Although Modesty was angry about this, it was useless. Although the dragons were powerful, they were not omnipotent. The most threatening attack was on the eve of the storm, but unfortunately, it did not deviate from Brando's prediction. He knew the character of the Black Dragon well, so he had already arranged a strategy to meet the attack. Moreover, this time even God was on the side of the humans. The storm lasted for 2 days and 2 nights, and the dragons were already exhausted. When they were forced by Modesty to launch their final attack, the sword of the Ash Sword Saint dispelled all of her delusions. Although the humans had the upper hand, but for the past 2 days, everyone recalled that it was a tragic battle. The fleet lost more than 10% of the warships, and the casualties were uncountable. Many people died in battle, but more losses came from the storm itself. It was a nightmare, but fortunately it was finally over. The sailors and officers, after shouting and cheering with all their might, one by one, fell down on the deck snoring. At this time there was no chief officer to urge them to stand up and continue fighting. Soon there was only one voice on the deck. "How lucky, my lord." The Shire was a mess. His beautiful magus robe was wrinkled and stuck to his body because it was soaked in water. He walked up to the poop, wiping the beads of water on his forehead with his hand, and complained to Brando, "We encountered a storm on the shining sea before. The storm on the open sea was much worse than here. Your grandfather vomited a lot at that time." Brando stared at the guy who ruined his grandfather's image. The Shire felt a little guilty under the stare. He spread out his hands and said, "Well, I admit that I vomited a little, but I'm a wizard. You know, our willpower is always stronger than the average person. Your face is so pale that it's not very convincing." "That's because I'm too sleepy, my lord. How come I didn't know that heroic spirits need to sleep?" "I think that lady has a different opinion," the Shire smiled. Brando knew that this guy was talking about Saint Tossel, the Wind Empress. He secretly cursed him for being cunning. He didn't dare to expose that elf's shortcomings. Tap. Brando heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw a pair of black high-heeled shoes. The rose inlaid on the tip of the shoes was as eye-catching as blood. It was as dazzling as snow. On the ankle was an ebony skirt. She had a slender waist, layers of lace corsets, and thin shoulder straps that tightly wrapped around her snow-white shoulders. She had a slender neck, a sharp chin, long hair that was dyed black, red eyes that were as bright as agate, slender eyebrows that were raised high, and a forehead that was as smooth as jade. "Why did you come out?" Brando frowned and asked unhappily. This was troublesome. It wasn't easy for him to get her on the ship without anyone noticing. He didn't want her to be exposed in public. If the successor of the Dark Dragon was a rat on the street, then if this lady's identity was exposed, he would immediately become the public enemy of the civilization. "It's too stuffy in the carriage." Dark Ko-Hua wrinkled her nose and made a sound that was almost undetectable. Brando glanced at the Shire, and the latter nodded knowingly. He placed his hand on his chest and bowed to Ko-Hua. "I'll go arrange rooms for Miss Eugenie and the others. There are too many people on the deck." Dark Kohua's eyes were filled with disdain. She was about to express her disdain for such hypocrisy when she heard Brando sternly say to her, "Come with me." The second deck of the Akenton's stern was surrounded by a hollow corridor. After the storm, a lot of rain had poured in, and the corridor was still wet. Brando silently led Dark Kohua through the corridor. Halfway through, he stopped and turned to look at her. "You're looking for trouble. You're obviously young, but you're as cautious as an old man." Dark Kohua pursed her lips. "I smelled the scent of those disgusting reptiles. I just wanted to see if you needed help. Those people outside don't recognize me at all. What are you afraid of? Don't underestimate humans. Don't forget who defeated you. Besides, I have a dragon on my ship. Do you think she won't recognize you?" Brando replied in annoyance. "No wonder it's so smelly here. But even dragons are divided into several generations. Little reptiles born after the age of chaos might not be able to recognize me." The girl snorted. "Besides, do you think I want to see a despicable person like you? If it wasn't for someone telling me to come out, I wouldn't be bothered to wander around this stinking place." "Someone told you to come out." Brando had expected this girl to be insincere. Although she said there was no need to worry, she was usually more cautious than anyone else. She wouldn't easily appear in front of anyone. This woman seemed arrogant on the surface, but she was a person who cherished her life and craved power. Unless she had no other choice, she wouldn't easily expose herself to danger. "I was the one who told her to come out." A gentle voice suddenly sounded in their minds. Brando was slightly startled. He immediately recognized the voice. The Wind Empress? He didn't expect that the Elf Queen, who hadn't appeared for a long time, would choose to appear at this time. He couldn't help but feel excited. In fact, he had a lot of questions to ask her, but the great sage didn't give him the opportunity to do so. "Brando." But Saint Tossel's voice was unusually serious today. Accompanied by her words, a shadow gradually formed in the corridor. Brando had seen the appearance of the sage in the Shaflan silver mine before, but she was not like this at that time. At this moment, the elf wore a silver crown and armor. The armor showed a faint purple brilliance. Her whole body was like a dragon bearing its fangs and brandishing its claws. A thick fur cloak trailed behind her. The edge of the cloak was embroidered with the royal emblem of the Mist Elves. On the inside, there was an emblem of intertwined stars and moons. An amethyst-like sword hung on the waist of the elf lady. On the hilt of the sword was the legendary treasure of the Mist Elves, the starry diamond. When Brando saw Saint Tossel like this, he couldn't help but be stunned, but he immediately reacted. This was the legendary armor of the Wind Empress in the War of the Holy Saints. It was also the symbol of the elven royal family, Stardust's Lament. Legend said that this armor had long disappeared in the long river of history with the Mist Elves. But when it reappeared one day on the body of the Queen of the Elves, it didn't lose any of its former glory. "The Wind Empress. You are." Brando didn't understand why the Wind Empress appeared in such a splendid attire. Was she trying to intimidate the she-wolf? It seemed that the Saint Tossel he knew was not such a superficial person. "Huh." Dark Kohua looked at the Wind Empress and let out a surprised sigh. "It really is the legacy of those guys in the Tower of Babel. I didn't expect to see it in this era." "What do you mean?" Brando interrupted her. "Brando." The Wind Empress took the initiative to continue the conversation. "Do you remember what I said to you last time?" "Last time?" "That time when you accepted Odin's inheritance. You said." Brando suddenly remembered the conversation at that time. "At that time you said that what you did and what Odin did after thousands of years may not be clearly defined by right or wrong. It's nothing more than different methods that lead to different endings." As if a bolt of lightning flashed through his mind, he immediately reacted. "It turns out that the Dark Dragon chose the wrong path and we may not be right," Saint Tossel interrupted Brando. "In fact, after the last battle, we have already expected today's result." "But why?" Brando looked at the Wind Empress in confusion. "Is what Master Tullman said true? This has to do with a legend, Brando." The Elf Empress looked at Kohua silently and replied faintly. "That was the time when the Night of Azure had not yet pierced through the sky and caused the meteors to fall to the ground, thus beginning the era of mortals. It was the time before the chaos. In that era described in countless hymns, the gods walked on the earth, and the earth was full of the gods' people, the silver race. The warriors of the gods, the golden race. And before them, there were even more glorious gods and servants. Under the glory of the gods, the earth was full of gold and jade, and the sweet water flowed in the rivers. The gods guided their people to cultivate and reproduce on this fertile land. The fire of civilization was prosperous and strong, and the silver race built countless miracles on the earth. The towers pierced the clouds, the cities floated above the clouds, the temples were piled up with jade, and the holy music in the temples was heard all year round. But in fact, the war history in the Pale poem told a completely different story. It was an era of war, bloodshed, and heroic sacrifice. In that era, the gods and their servants also faced a terrible enemy, the Twilight Dragon. Countless battles, countless reconstructions on the ruins, and civilization collapsed several times. And in the last era, the Twilight Dragon even captured the most powerful fortress of the Silver Race, Babel's Tower. The darkness of civilization. This was the terrible disaster recorded in the Pale poem of the Cruz people, recorded on the war slate, and recorded in the Dark Prophecy. Countless civilizations were destroyed, and the legacy of the past was scattered on the earth. After countless years, the once noble silver race had to trudge on the earth, cut through the thorns and find everything that was lost. Until a hero appeared in this world. The Knight of Azure. The legend that changed everything. After the azure spear pierced the sky and caused the Twilight Dragon to fall into a deep sleep, the Myrnas appeared on the earth. A prophet led them across the Great Plains and built the first civilized empire after the gods left wound in the wilderness of today's four-leaf clover. This was the Myrnas Empire, and this was the beginning of the era of mortals. And that prophet, he had no name, but the legend about him was passed down from generation to generation. Because since then, every generation of Myrnas had a prophet, and they had a common name, the Dark Dragon. Chapter 981. When the Dark Dragon passed down to Odin's generation, the civilization and rule of the Myrnas had reached its peak. However, under the prosperity there was a disharmony. At that time, the main characters of the land were not the Black Iron folk who now ruled Wound. They were just barbarians in the mountains, and the main members of the Black Iron folk, humans and mountain dwarves, were the vassals of the Myrnas. The Myrnas were very indifferent to the Black Iron folk, especially when the Dark Dragon reached Odin's generation. The empire was tyrannical and harsh to its vassals. Odin once conquered the humans on the Great Plains, built a fortress on the glacier, and migrated the dwarves to the Cloud Mountains. These two migrations alone caused the dwarves and humans to lose nearly half of their population. If the Myrnas were like this to their vassals, it was needless to say to the other Black Iron folk. It was usually a bloody suppression. They did not care about other races besides the Black Iron folk. At that time, the Silver Elves and the Mist Elves had their own kingdoms. Although most of them were isolated from the world, they still could not avoid dealing with the outside world. However, the Myrnas were high and mighty and ignored these silver folk. They only looked up to the Buga who built a city on the shining coast. These wizards were said to be the guardians of the Tower of Babel, the descendants of the scholars of Aegido. As for the dragons, they were in the midst of the famous chaos of Aegido. They had no time to care about other things, let alone deal with the outside world. The Myrnas were getting more and more arrogant, and their rule was getting harsher and harsher. Finally, one day the conflicts erupted like a volcano. Just as recorded in history, the opportunity came from Odin ordering the Mist Elves to work with the Myrnas to participate in the crusade against the barbarians. This order deeply hurt the sensitive and proud self-esteem of the Mist Elves, so they naturally rejected this unreasonable request without mercy. Odin was furious and immediately ordered sabers to lead an army to attack the Laurel Forest where the Mist Elves' kingdom was located. The fuse of the War of the Holy Saints, the Uyua War between the Myrnas and the Mist Elves began. He had no choice but to be angry. At this point, the Wind Empress sighed to herself. Odin is a smart man. He saw the internal conflicts of the empire. He wanted to use our submission to intimidate others, but he didn't expect that we would dare to refuse. Odin is too impatient, Brando thought with a frown. When he received the inheritance of the Dark Dragon, he had seen the emperor of the Myrna people once in a dream. At that time, the impression that the other party had given him was not that of a headstrong person, But when he was trying to figure out the mentality of the elves, he made a huge mistake. The silver folk also had their own pride. The mist elves were not vassals of the Myrna people, so how could they bow down to the Myrna people? Saint Tossel saw his expression and knew what he was thinking. She shook her head and said, "The will of the dark dragon isn't that easy to reject. You can't imagine how powerful the Myrna people were in that era. Brando, you know that the silver elves are brave and good at fighting, but they might not even be able to win against the Myrna people, let alone us." "Then you?" Brando asked, puzzled. "We got a hint in advance." The Wind Empress replied word by word. "What?" "We got the promise of the Buga people," the Wind Empress said slowly. "In fact, the dissatisfaction with the Myrna people on the continent has been going on for a long time. Needless to say, in the Empire, the Silver Elves and the Mist Elves were not willing to be marginalized. The promise of the Buga people was like an opportunity for us. Soon, the Silver Elves joined this secret covenant. Coincidentally, as if fate had arranged it at this time, the human resistance army that was suppressed by the Myrna people also crossed the wilderness under the leadership of the Flame King Gretel and returned to Wonde. Today in the Whitestone Wilderness, we signed the covenant that has been passed down to the present, which is the oath you call the Sacred Covenant. From then on, the War of the Holy Saints began. You know what happened after that?" Brando heard this and did not ask, because he knew that this was the history he was familiar with. Today, what the elven lady was going to tell him must be another, unknown secret. Sure enough, after a moment of silence, the Wind Empress spoke again. "But in fact, there are several suspicious points in the whole War of the Holy Saints. The biggest question is, later, we privately confirmed with the Buga people that the reason they participated in the war was because they got the promise of the dragon, and before that, they did not send any invitation to us. As for the dragon's side, the situation is similar." Brando raised his eyebrows, faintly smelling the scent of a conspiracy from this paragraph. The Flame King Gretel, under mysterious guidance, crossed the dark wilderness. In the early years, Gretel, Fanzin and I used to adventure on the continent together. Although we lost contact after he became the leader of the resistance army, I believe that he would not lie about this. Besides, Fanzin and Eloranta had similar experiences. In other words, behind the War of the Holy Saints, there is actually a force behind it, and this force does not belong to any side of the humans, elves, wizards, or dragons. Brando finally could not help but stop and ask. The Wind Empress also stopped. This former sage looked out at the vast and blue sea outside the corridor, her light purple eyes flashing with an inexplicable brilliance. "Yes, in fact, I met that person later. She was called Sophie, a witch." "Witch? Witch?" Although before this, Brando's mind had all kinds of answers, but he never thought of this special group of witches. They were the loyal followers of the Dark Dragon, and even today, even in open opposition to the world of order, they did not give up their beliefs. Needless to say, the Queen of Witches was the former mistress of the Myrna Empire. How could such a group betray the Myrna people? The Wind Empress nodded. "This group of witches is from the Pharaoh. They and the witches of the 13th moon are the two most unique groups of witches in the witch world. Sophie is not her name. Every generation of their orthodox descendants is called Sophie, just like the Dark Dragon. After the War of the Holy Saints ended, she personally found me and told me all this." "Why?" Brando asked, very puzzled. "Because of the Black Prophecy." "Black Prophecy?" The Wind Empress skipped this question and asked, "Brando, do you think someone as smart as Odin would fall into the trap of his own people? Could it be because he trusted the witches too much?" "No, that's not the case. After thinking about it carefully, I'm afraid he already knew all this. When we rebelled, even if the humans, dwarves, elves, and bugas, as well as a few other races such as the gnomes and halflings joined together, I'm afraid we weren't sure if we could really defeat the Empire. The strength of the Myrna people is unimaginable to people now." This was the second time she said this, but in the eyes of Saint Tossel, it seemed to be a matter of course, because the Myrna Empire ruled by the Dark Dragon was so frightening. But they were defeated after all. Brando comforted. "No." The Wind Empress shook her head decisively. "It's not as simple as you think, Brando. From the beginning to the end, only Sabers and Tumen's legions participated in suppressing our rebellion. Sabers belongs to the Dark Dragon's forbidden army, and Tumen's is just some militia. The Myrna people have 7 legions, And these 7 legions have never appeared in the entire War of the Holy Saints. What? This time Brando was really surprised. It could be explained that the 7 legions of the Myrna people did not appear in the early stages of the War of the Holy Saints because they did not attract attention. But after the decisive battle between the 4 sages and sabers, anyone with a discerning eye could see that the Myrna Empire had reached its end at that time, and even the dark dragon Odin himself had to participate in the battle. Under such circumstances, the possibility of the Myrna people still hiding their strength was too small, unless the so-called 7 legions of the Myrna people were just a complete scam. But, is that possible? The Wind Empress continued. In fact, until we attacked the Alkash region, we had always thought that the Dark Dragon had arranged a trap to make us believe that we had won. The only doubt was that most people more or less felt that our strength was not enough to make Odin go to war. It wasn't until Odin personally participated in the final battle, and was defeated that we dared to believe that all of this was true. In fact, until the final battle, Odin had not used his strongest strength. She paused for a moment. You are also a planeswalker, Brando. Do you know what kind of power a planeswalker possesses? That is extraordinary power, the power of a world. This power has its own system in the world of planeswalkers, and it is on a completely different level from the power that we possess, whether it is magic or physical strength. Unless we can use the power of the entire world to fight against the power of the planeswalkers, it is impossible for us to win. To put it simply, a planeswalker is actually a god. He is like a god who came here from a distant world. He controls all the rules of that world, and the creatures and forces of the entire world obey his orders unconditionally. If we want to fight against him, we have to become the god of our world first. But as everyone knows, the god of our world has long been away from the disputes of the mortal world. So, in theory, it is impossible for us to win against Odin. But planeswalkers also need to plunder resources. He can't squander his power without limit. Odin just changed his method of plundering power from this world to support the power of his world. As long as you find a way to defeat him from this source, it's not like there's no hope of victory. In fact, isn't that what you're doing, Lady Wind Empress? You are the same as us in that era, thinking of the problem too simply. But the problem is, the Dark Dragon is not alone. He can seize power from us, and he can also seize power from others. As a dignified emperor of an empire with so many people supporting him, would he really fight against us alone? Saint Tossel seemed to have been prepared for this question, and calmly retorted. Brando was stunned. He remembered that this was not what the Wind Empress had said last time. Moreover, history did not describe it this way. But he did come to challenge you alone. Is it because he is too confident? Odin is no longer a young boy. He is the supreme of a huge empire. He would not do something reckless for this false reputation. Actually, Fanzin and I saw some clues in the battle. Later, before Odin died, he asked us to keep a secret for him, which confirmed my guess. He asked you, for sages to keep a secret for him. What kind of secret is that? Brando only realized that it was inappropriate when he asked this question, and hurriedly tried to remedy it. Sorry, if it is not convenient, then forget it. He suddenly thought that since the Wind Empress had said this, the 4 sages must have agreed to Odin's request at that time. Some of the things that Tumen had said to him before also proved this point. In that case, he could not let the Wind Empress be a person who went back on her words. Besides, heroes like the 4 sages were unlikely to go back on their words. But unexpectedly, the Wind Empress shook her head indifferently and said, Actually, it's nothing. I came out today to tell you the truth. I've thought about it. Since you are the person chosen by Odin, there are some things that you should know. Brando shut his mouth but frowned faintly. He suddenly heard a sense of farewell from the tone of the Elf Empress. He faintly felt that the sage who had accompanied him for so long and taken care of him like an elder was about to choose to leave. Saint Tossel pondered for a moment before slowly replying. The secret that he asked us to keep is very simple. It is to let the result of the War of the Holy Saints become an established fact. In fact, he had already expected all of this. He told us some things. The Twilight Dragon has never really died. The first generation of the Dark Dragon, Azure Knight, only seriously injured it and made it return to the Sea of Chaos. However, the hour hand of the Judgment Day has never slowed down. There is such a legend in the Dark Prophecy. It says that a hero will be born from the mortals, holding the key of fate and opening another door for the future of this world. That is the rebirth of order on the ashes after the dusk of all things and gods. After the disaster of Babel Fortress, civilization was once lost on the earth. Many people, including our generation, thought that the hero among the mortals was Azure Knight, because he was the one who made the stars fall to the earth and started the era of mortals. However, fate played a cruel joke on us. This is a secret that only a few people know. Since the establishment of the Myrna Empire, they have been engaged in a fierce war with the Twilight Army outside the elemental frontier. Therefore, won't had a short respite. The Elf Queen smiled slightly, but her smile was a little tired. We thought that what we did was right. The War of the Holy Saints was just a war against oppression. However, from the beginning we guessed the beginning correctly but not the end. Unfortunately, it was our own people who gave the Dark Dragon a fatal blow. At the last moment of the dynasty's collapse, Odin ordered the 7 legions to be permanently stationed outside the elemental frontier. He also joined forces with several other planeswalkers to seal Wone's passage to the Sea of Chaos. This was his last gift to us. He was a stupid guy, but this gift was precious. This gift exhausted the strength of him and everyone around him, so it became the reason for his inevitable failure. The Wind Empress sighed softly. In fact, this was also the reason why the witches betrayed him. Odin did not believe in fate. Everything he wanted to do was just to prove that everything said in the Black Prophecy was not necessarily right. The world did not need to be destroyed to be reborn, and there was never a savior. But the witches believed in the power of prophecy. The end of the world was bound to come. Odin had proved that he was not the person in the prophecy, so the Myrna people had to give up this stage for the Iron Folk. They were waiting for the arrival of the final prophecy in the Black Prophecy. The witches of the Moon of Law were the executors of this prophecy. Brando was speechless for a long time. He had already guessed part of the truth, but it was only today that it was confirmed. This was the inheritance of the fool. It was the arrogant struggle of a man who overestimated himself. Although it was ridiculous, it was worth remembering forever, because people would never bow down to fate. Now that the truth was out, he couldn't help but rub his chest. In a sense, he was also the one who had overestimated his capabilities. Whether it was in the eyes of the noble heroine, in the eyes of the princess, or in the eyes of others, perhaps even the Bugas who supported him behind the scenes, or even the people around him, they might not be able to understand his ideals. He knew that many people stood by him only because they believed that he could change something. They might not agree with his true thoughts deep in his heart. What did he want the world to be like? Brando did not answer, but his eyes had already crossed the sublime inland sea. He knew that there, beyond the borders of civilization, there were countless undeveloped lands. Civilization did not have to be trapped in one place, and the power of the twilight was not invincible. These thoughts were somewhat out of tune with this world that was deeply mired in chaos, perhaps even too distant. Just like how the Kurlutz people would never work together with the Farnezan people, the Wind Elves would never be able to integrate themselves into the human world without reservation, not to mention the undead and countless troubles and conflicts. But would he become a fool like Odin? Brando felt that he could not answer this question for a while. Maybe not, just like how he did not agree with all of Odin's ideas. Maybe the problem is not here. He said slowly. The glorious deeds of the 4 sages, the alliance of the continent's 100 races, may not be a mistake. Odin may be doing what he thinks is right, but there are many ways to accomplish one thing. He believes that fate can be changed, but he sees himself as the savior. Brando looked at the magnificent scenery under the fleet. The thick clouds scattered like cotton wool blown away by the wind, revealing the golden sea surface. But there were more things in his mind. The diligent Blackie has published a new book again. Let me recommend it to everyone. I feel that it has improved a lot compared to the last book. Title: Ling Tianji, Book Number 3296695. Introduction. With a thought, 10,000 laws follow. With a thought, the moon is bright and the wind is clear. The 9 states is vast, hundreds of millions of miles. The Emperor of Great Zhou appoints the world to the people. The Taoist court is above the 9 heavens, educating the 9 states. Outside the 9 states, the demon kingdom of the northern wilderness is eyeing covetously. The southern barbarian shaman sect is ambitious. The Saha Buddhist land in the west preaches to the 9 states and is in the ascendant. A young scholar who has read all kinds of classics since childhood transmigrates to this world. He fights the barbarian shaman and fights the demons. He discusses the Tao with the Bodhisattva and smiles with the Taoist lord. He builds the heavenly court, establishes the netherworld, opens the 6 paths of reincarnation, and becomes the celestial emperor. Chapter 982. The two stood in the corridor and did not speak for a long time. Brando suddenly spoke. Lady Wind Empress, I have one last question. Is it about the secret of the final battlefield? The Wind Empress seemed to have expected this question. Yes, I want to know what the Silver Empress saw in that temple and why there was a Somir crystal there. According to what you said, since Odin asked you to keep it a secret for him, why would he leave a message there? I think there must be a reasonable answer behind all this. The Wind Empress was silent for a moment. I think this may be an accident, but maybe not. That human girl may have seen the node there and saw something outside our world through the node. Node. This is the biggest secret of the final battle. Why did the final battle move around the entire Alkash region? It's all because of us. It's all because of us, because Odin's seal of the entire world, and the node of the seal is located in the center of the final battlefield, which is in that temple. I suspect that someone deliberately let that human girl see what is behind the seal. This person may be the Darkness Dragon or may not be. If it's not the Darkness Dragon, Brando's voice lowered a little. Regarding the answer to this question, both of them tacitly did not continue, because other than the Darkness Dragon, there was only one force that had the motive to do so, and that was the Twilight Dragon. The hidden message behind this was too terrifying, to the point that Brendel could not help but tremble in fear. The Bugas may have also guessed this. The Wind Empress paused for a moment before replying. They may have originally hoped that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would stand on their side, but Vala's performance undoubtedly disappointed them, so they came to you. This is also the reason why you must stop Her Majesty the Empress. I understand. Brando nodded. In fact, even if it was not for this reason, just for Scarlet, it was enough for him to stand on the opposite side of Her Majesty the Empress. There was another long period of silence. It was as if the past of the War of the Holy Saints was always shrouded in a layer of fog, and seemed mysterious and unfathomable until the truth was known. But when all the truth was revealed, it made people speechless. It was as if both of them understood that there was no need to continue the discussion on this issue. After a long time, Saint Tossel said faintly, Brando, actually, I'm here to bid you farewell. Hearing this unexpected sentence, Brando was not surprised. He just took a deep breath and asked, Are you going back to Saint Tossel, Lady Wind Empress? The Wind Empress nodded. The time has come. We have guarded the secret for Odin for 1,000 years, and the seal he and Kelsey left behind is getting weaker and weaker. Now that the demonic wave is coming, the connection between the Sea of Chaos and Wound has reached its closest point in 1,000 years. The power of Twilight is recovering, and the demon's restlessness proves this point. Therefore, I must return to Saint Tossel. In fact, I have already guessed the reason why the Bugas came to you. I also don't agree with the choice of the human empress. Her choice is just repeating the old path that the Darkness Dragon has walked once, and it is impossible to succeed. Go ahead and do it, Brando. The Wind Elves will support you. Brando was silent. He knew the temperament of the Wind Empress, and it was meaningless to persuade her to stay. Are you ready, Lady Wind Empress? The Saint Tossel of today is no longer the same as before. Of course I know, but there are some things that I have to do, little guy, because there is only one Saint Tossel in this world. Yes, there is only one Saint Tossel in this world. The Mist Elves may no longer exist, but the national emblem of the Elven Empire is still the Wind Empress sacred emblem. This is the meaning of motherland and homeland, not to mention that it is the country that she founded. No matter what she said, Brando knew in his heart that the Sage Empress would never truly let go of her people. 1,000 years have passed, and this feeling has become deeper and deeper. I am not unprepared. Including the Hunter siblings, more than half of the Knight by my side back then have gathered, and I also know the whereabouts of some others. The 24 rings symbolize the national emblem of Saint Tossel, and soon people will understand that this is actually just a symbolic meaning. Only then did Brando remember the Hunter siblings that he saved in the deadly Frost Forest. The girl who was as agile as a cheetah had left a deep impression on him, and the two of them had stayed in Valhalla after that incident. He was silent for a while, but he was still very reluctant to part with them. Ever since he first met the Elven Empress under the Shaflund silver mine, it seemed that a long time had passed unknowingly. He did not know when it started, but he had gradually gotten used to having this kind of person who was both a teacher and a friend, like a big sister next door. She was once a sage, but also his teacher. Although he had long been honed into a true man, he still felt melancholy in his heart. The Wind Empress looked at him, and a series of words like a nightingale's voice blurted out, "That's Vin Master." This was an elven proverb, and the general idea was that one day, even a cub would have to leave the nest. Brando understood what she meant, and just as he was about to say something, the Wind Empress continued, "Brando, do you still remember the first time we met?" Brando froze for a moment. He naturally remembered that it was under the Shaflund silver mine, and everything that happened back then was still fresh in his mind. He was much more impulsive than he was now, causing a lot of trouble in the Abbes, but he also got to know many people because of it. Jutta, Cornelius, and Rabin were now his capable subordinates. Although Coden was already retired in Menta, he still acted as a link between him and the old nobles. There was also Odom, the bad-tempered old dwarf who was now in charge of the construction of Valhalla Fortress. There were also the youths under the Shire, Lyrian, Morkan, and many others who had left their status as apprentices and became true wizards. There were also some who joined his fleet and became young captains. Now that he thought about it, that was the beginning of his career. It was also the beginning of him becoming the Lord of Erewhon. After that, he had experienced many things, and under the guidance of the sage, he was now much more mature and learned more about the secrets of this world. He was no longer the brat of the past, but a true lord. The past experiences and troubles had now become a heavy memory. In the end, there was only one image left in his mind. It was the mountains of Yusong. The starry night hung low, and the mountains were silent. The rolling hills were undulating, and a lone building stood in the midst of the pine trees. In the dark night, the cold moonlight flowed like water into the corridor. It was a fake oil painting, a knight's sword shining with cold light, a young man covered in blood, and a shining ring. That was the beginning of everything. Inside and outside the Lion Palace, a heavy rain dominated the night in the center of the empire. Under the deep dome, Vala wore a red holy robe and held a golden scepter that represented the golden holy flame. The increasingly old great priest today bent his body and looked at the woman in front of him with turbid eyes. The Silver Queen wore a black dress with a beautiful white rose pinned on her chest, as if she was wearing a funeral dress. She sneered as she looked at the sacred hall. There was a hint of condescension in her smile, as if the indisputable majesty and holiness of the sacred hall were nothing but dust in her eyes. A bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, passing through the wooden grids of the large arched window that hung down to the ground. It was like a print depicting disaster and the end of the world, illuminating the faces of everyone in the great sage hall with snow-white light. The light of the candles was only a weak ball in the white rainy night. It was not until the lightning zigzagged away from the sky that the hall was once again enveloped in warm light. But Vala's heart was cold. Shadows were gathering outside the arched window like silent ghosts. Flecks of red light flickered in the darkness, coming closer and closer, gradually converging into a torrent. Vala raised her head shakily and saw all this. The wild beasts covered in manes, baring their fangs and sharp teeth, were leaping from rooftops far and near, raising their heads and letting out a long howl or two. In the distance, echoing screams were heard from farther blocks. Even though it was raining, cats and dogs all over the city were screaming crazily in the night. Everything was like the scene before the end of the world. Vala's heart was cold. Those were the sinners, the werewolves of Senia, the last people with the blood of the Myrnas. And today they were back. One by one, the figures overlapped in front of him. The once tall and glorious statues of the sages that he yearned for. After the terrible upheaval, the sacred light that shrouded them gradually dissipated. One by one, the lights went out, and the road ahead was finally plunged into a dark fog. It was a scene he had witnessed in the past few decades. He had seen with his own eyes the sacred hall that was full of vigor and vitality slowly fade away. The people's unwavering faith gradually wavered, and they fell into a desperate state of self-doubt. The road ahead was long gone, and everything was over. He suddenly remembered the moment when he received the holy crown and the scepter. At that time the golden sun shrouded the entire Leo palace, and the spire of the palace shone with the most dazzling light. But that was just before sunset. When the Senior Bolton woke up from his nightmare, purple lightning zigzagged across the sky. Outside the window it was raining cats and dogs. He was lying on a thin wooden bed, his face snow-white from the illumination of the lightning. "Sifrid," he subconsciously called out, but there was no response. He stared blankly for a moment before remembering that his daughter had already moved to Valhalla, where she was learning how to grasp the power of the forest goddess from the druid elders. All that was left in the land of darkness was the rustling of the rain. Occasionally white lightning flashed, but Bolton felt a little uneasy. There was no moon in the rainy night, but he seemed to be able to hear a strong call in his heart. It was the wild instinct in the Senia bloodline. Usually, this most primitive desire for destruction would only be aroused under the brilliance of the magic moon, but today was a little abnormal. He slowly sat up on the bed and listened to the movements outside. After Grodin's death, the entire Green Village was moved to this place under the young lord's arrangements. It was located in the middle of the mountains and forests. He could usually hear the sound of the wind rising and falling under the night sky, but on this rainy night, he could only hear one or two howls that pierced through the curtain of rain. He did not know if it was the wolves of the forest or some other beast. Bolton was speechless. Amidst the faint uneasiness, he suddenly recalled the strange dream he had. It was said that when a person woke up from a dream, the memory of the dream would be particularly deep. For him this was exactly the case. The most terrifying scenes in the dream replayed repeatedly in his mind. The scenes in the dream were strange and absurd, but he vaguely felt that they were somewhat real. He saw a sea of fire descending, the earth cracking, stars piercing through the clouds and falling from the sky. The mountains and rivers were flattened, and the sea was steaming. The whole world was falling apart and turning into ashes. A terrifying dragon stretched across the starry sky, watching Won's destruction with a cold gaze. In that hellish scene, he seemed to hear the wails of countless people. His people, his daughter, they were all buried in the sea of fire. Then all the scenes collapsed. He remembered a tall figure standing in front of him, ordering him to pledge his loyalty with an unquestionable tone. Thousands of voices echoed in his mind, turning into a loud rumble. "The dark dragon has been resurrected. The times have changed. Obey her orders. Obey her orders." Asterisk bang. Asterisk Bolton's eyes were red. He suddenly slammed his fist on the bed. He roared in a low voice, suppressing the urge to turn into a wolf. When he woke up the next moment, his head was already covered in cold sweat, and a deep fear rose from his heart. This primitive and fatal impulse was the biggest weakness of the Senia people, but usually, only when the power of the demon moon was at its peak would he feel this wild power in his blood become restless. What was going on? He took 2 deep breaths, but before he could calm the uneasiness in his heart, the door was pushed open with a loud bang. A young man who was drenched stood outside the door, looking at him in panic. He said, "Uncle Bolton, it's not good. Something big has happened." The young man's face was pale, and he looked like he was out of his wits. Myrna came to the village. She said her name is Sophie. She's a witch." A bright flash of lightning pierced through the window and into the depths of Scarlet's orange-red eyes. She looked up and was surprised to see the woman who suddenly appeared in front of her. It was the statue of the Saintess of the Lion Palace, wearing a holy robe and covered in blood. On the balcony on the 3rd floor of the castle, Sydney Metferica stood in the rain. At this moment there were 3 deep wounds on her face. The blood had long dried up, and the wound was washed white by the rain. One of her eyes was squinted because of the severe injury, but this did not change the woman's cold and almost stiff expression. Her remaining one-eyed angel, Aroma, was still burning fiercely and coldly staring at Scarlet. Although there were many wounds and blood stained her robe, Scarlet had an illusion that the blood on the woman in front of her was far less than that of her enemy. But at this moment in the capital of the empire, how could such a battle happen? She had heard of the woman's reputation and knew that the enemy who could hurt her like this must not be simple. If such an enemy appeared in the central area controlled by the Cruz people, then the empire would not have many days to live. So, it could only be an internal conflict of the empire. Scarlet vaguely guessed something in an instant. After these days of nurturing, she had begun to have a political mind. She was no longer the confused and restless little girl. Besides, these days, the Silver Queen had strictly limited the number of times she and the maids went out. This action implied a signal. The situation in the empire had been tense day by day. The queen had already made her move. It seemed that her target was the holy sanctum. But Scarlet still did not understand why the statue of the Saintess of the Lion Palace appeared here, in front of her. While Scarlet was puzzled, Sydney was also thinking. It was not the first time she had seen this charming mountain girl. She had recently been conferred the title of Countess and the title of Mountain Princess. But Sydney understood that this was not the true purpose of the stubborn queen. She wanted the mountain people to marry a real princess of the empire, so that they could be tied to the queen's chariot. It was a pity that the little girl was still at a loss. Scarlet opened her mouth slightly as if she wanted to ask something, but in the end, she could not make a sound. "I'm here to find you," Sydney interrupted her with a slightly cold voice. "Her Majesty intends to marry you to Prince Hamuer to consolidate her relationship with the mountain people, and ensure that you can stay in the empire." Scarlet was slightly startled at first, then she reacted and clenched her fists. The mountain girl bit her lower lip. Although she did not speak, her expression was enough to show her thoughts. "It seems that you don't agree. You want me to help you? You can take me away." "No, I can't protect myself, but I want to see your lord. I need you to introduce me. I can help you pass a message." Scarlet stared at her closely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the torrential rain and the sound of the rain washing the stone wall could be heard. After a long time, the mountain girl hesitated. It was only for a moment, but Sydney had already seen her mouth. There were only 6 words. "Save me, Lord. Why do students always say that I'm a monthly update? In the future, I'll be a young gentleman who never stops updating." Continue to recommend Hey 13th's new work, Ling Tianji. If you can help recommend and collect it, please help. Chapter 983. After passing through the storm, the temperament of the sublime inland sea became unusually mild. A week later, at noon of the 8th day to be exact, a black arc appeared on the horizon where the sky and sea were the same color as the sea. It was the mountains of Metz. The sailors remeasured the position of the fleet, and confirmed that they were in the waters near Fathom Tan. In fact, the Imperial patrol ships with red sails could already be seen on the sea level. This Imperial patrol ship came from the nearby Fathom Tan port. The sailors on the ship were obviously frightened when they saw a huge fleet coming out of the clouds in the afternoon sun. They were in a flurry for a while before they sent out a signal and asked who they were. They usually ask with the wind message spell when they get close. Sometimes they also use flag signals. "They should be warning the port now," Ivram explained in a muffled voice as he stood by the bow of the ship. Brando nodded and responded faintly. "Tell them our identity." "Did you see clearly what they said?" Hellman, the captain of the Imperial patrol ship, turned around and asked his second in command. The drunken old man was already half sober from the shock. He threw away the wine bottle, took the brass binoculars, and looked at the unfamiliar fleet in front of him shakily. "They said, they are the fleet of the Bugas," the first in command replied with trepidation. "What, the Bugas? What are they doing here? Are you sure you're not mistaken?" "Sir, I'm sure I'm not mistaken unless they are using the wrong flag signal." "Then what do you think?" Hellman touched his unshaven chin. "This is the fleet of the Bugas?" The first in command stared at the sea of sails shining like silver scales on the clouds. His expression was complicated, but he still nodded honestly. It was the one and only fleet in the world, the fleet of the Silver City. The nominal owner of Fatham Harbor, Baron Ludwig Metz, was a little restless in his office today. Just a quarter of an hour ago, the men he sent finally figured out the origin of the fleet that suddenly appeared at his doorstep. It was really the fleet of the Bugas, and it was said that they had encountered the air force of the Jorgendy Ridge south of Lone Harbor and fought once. It seemed that these Bugas were actually allies of the Empire. However, the wizards rarely intervened in mortal wars. Even in the previous Holy War, they watched coldly from the sidelines. Baron Metz did not understand why the other party suddenly changed their attitude, but at least they brought news of the Evergreen Corridor south of the Evergreen Corridor, and the noble refugees, which could not be faked. His second-in-command also said that he saw Earl Alcorn and a few other leading figures among the refugees. With these people as witnesses, Baron Metz did not think that the other party was faking it. However, seeing the huge fleet docked in the harbor, Baron Ludwig Metz could not help but be a little worried. He was not worried about anything else but how long these wizards would stay here. It was not a simple matter to support the logistics of such a huge fleet. Even if the other party was self-sufficient, with so many warships flooding into the harbor, it was inevitable that the harbor would be affected. Not to mention other things, just the number of berths alone was reduced by more than half, and all of that was money. On the other hand, as the lord of a city, Baron Metz was also respected in the empire, but after all, the other party was a silver person, and had unknowingly surpassed the ordinary people. The empire had always boasted of being the center of civilization, but this center was usually limited to the area under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Even Fanzin and Saint-Tassel might not be respected, let alone other places. Nowadays, most people advocated civilization and order, and it was well known that most of the civilizations of this era were inherited from the previous era, and many had been lost in the flames of war, not to mention the priceless ancient documents stored in Babel Tower before the Battle of Dusk. In this regard, the Silver people had an innate advantage over the Black Iron civilization, not to mention the craftsmen wizards who boasted of being the keepers of knowledge. Therefore, in the eyes of the world of this era, the arrogant and isolated Bugas were simply synonymous with glory and civilization, born to be high and mighty. Among the ordinary nobles, the culture of the Silver City-state was very much admired, especially in the territories of the major empires, to the extent that it had almost reached a morbid level of subservience to culture. Although Baron Ludwig Metz was pragmatic and was not the kind of hardcore Bugas admirer, but as a member of the high-ranking noble circle, it was inevitable that he would be affected. When he thought of having to deal with those white-robed, gentle craftsmen wizards in the clouds for a moment, he felt a little uneasy in his heart. If Brando knew that an excuse he casually made up could give rise to such a mentality in an imperial noble who had been on the battlefield for a long time, he wondered if he would laugh his head off. But at least he would never believe that there were any gentle craftsmen wizards. When he was a player, he had stayed in the Silver City-state for quite a long time, and the wizards he had seen were generally of two kinds, either very pragmatic or similar to science fanatics. The former were mostly from the Silver Council, and the latter were mostly from the Silver Society. At this moment, the Baron was thinking about what kind of attitude he should use to meet these noble guests later. Suddenly he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He raised his head, and the office door was suddenly pushed open with a creak. This change made Baron Ludwig Metz frown slightly, thinking that these Southerners really did not know etiquette. They pushed the door open without waiting for the announcement. He did not expect that it would be the Bugas who came in from outside. In his opinion, the Silver folk should be much more civilized than the people on the ground, and certainly would not do such a rude thing. As soon as the door opened, Baron Ludwig Metz did not see the silver-robed Bugas wizards, but what made his eyes widen was a group of soldiers in armor, blue battle robes and halberds. These soldiers were certainly not his subordinates, because he had seen them come straight up to him and pointed their spears at him from left and right. "You are..." Baron Ludwig Metz was stunned for a moment before he finally found the origin of this military uniform in the deepest part of his mind. His expression changed several times, and finally he blurted out, "Erwin's men?" It was Erwin's men. Unfortunately, Baron Ludwig Metz realized it a little late. In fact, this was exactly what Brando wanted to achieve. He used the Bugas fleet as a cover, hoping to make the people in Fathom Harbor lower their guard. Fortunately, the fleet itself was built by the Bugas, and the warships themselves followed the consistent style of the wizards. In addition, Count Alcorn and others on the ship testified, even if the crew's people wanted to be suspicious, it would be quite difficult. Things developed as he expected, and the fleet entered the port without any hindrance. After the warships docked, the soldiers on the warships rushed down to remove the weapons in the hands of the crew's harbor guards. Those guys still could not believe that the Bugas wizards would suddenly turn hostile and attack them. After all, in their opinion, the silver folk did not care about what happened in the mortal world at all. Worldly power was like a fleeting cloud to them. Thousands of years of tradition had almost formed a kind of inertia, and this inertia allowed Brando to build a great advantage. He commanded the Shire, Eugenie, Marjorie, Ivram, and others to take over the entire harbor, and then personally led a team directly to the castle where Baron Ludwig Metz was located. They did not encounter any resistance along the way, and even the castle guards personally opened the gate for them. When they were forced to have their weapons confiscated, they were stunned and asked these Erewhon's men what they wanted to do. But when these people finally realized that they were not facing the Bugas, but Erewhon's men, they showed a similar look to Ludwig Metz himself. First they were shocked and could not believe it, then they were shocked and could not believe it. For these people, Brando did not have time to answer their doubts for the time being. With a wave of his hand, they were all locked up in the dungeon under the castle. In this way, almost without any trouble, he and his fleet took over the harbor. Of course, this was only temporary. After all, he was just an outsider. If he wanted to rule such a huge city, it was definitely not enough to rely on the few Awin people in his hands. At most, he could only capture the upper echelons in one fell swoop. As for the lower echelons, he did not have the time nor the ability to capture all of them. Moreover, even if he had the ability to do so, who would manage the city for him after he locked them all up in the dungeon? In order to make such a huge port work, the amount of manpower needed was not small. Fortunately, he did not only have Erewhon's men in his hands, but also a considerable number of Crew's nobles. These people were all prominent figures in the empire. With these people in his hands, he could justifiably take over the city under the pretext of military control. The empire was in a state of internal and external troubles. On the east side of the Evergreen Corridor, the empire and the Wind Elves were locked in a fierce battle. On the south side, there was the sudden appearance of the Jorgendi Ridge army. Not to mention, a few days ago, the Lion Men of Toquinen finally captured the Anzaruta fortress group. It could be said that at this time, the situation in the south of the empire was in a deep quagmire, and even the Metz region was exposed. At this time, they were nominally allies of the empire. Abuga's fleet, after reaching a consensus with the nobles of the empire, was here to rest and help them fight against the Jorgendi Ridge army. It did not sound very strange. At this time, letting the nobles of the Southern Empire contact the middle-level officials would not give the Crew's people in the harbor the illusion that they were occupied. It would make them feel that the harbor was still under the control of the empire, and this Buga's fleet was just a temporary amulet. Of course, to do all this, he must reach a consensus with Count Alcorn and the others. Brando had not thought about how to deal with these fleeing nobles. After all, taking over a harbor from an empire's governor sounded like a rebellion. For these fleeing nobles, they might not be willing to be on the same boat as him. But he did not expect that an empire merchant ship that they captured on the route would be of great help to him. At that time, he originally ordered the capture of the merchant ship because he was afraid that the other party would leak the news that such a huge fleet had appeared in the heart of the empire. But when they boarded the ship, they found that the bottom of the merchant ship was full of refugees from the heart of the empire. These refugees brought them unimaginable news. A civil war broke out. During the week they were sailing on the Sublime Sea, or to be exact, on the second day after they left Lone Harbor, the Kurlutz Empire underwent earth-shattering changes. Her Majesty the Queen suddenly took control of an army that had never appeared before. This army was composed of the Senia and the Myernas. She directly deprived Vala of his authority as the Pope of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and announced a religious reform. A religious reform initiated by a secular monarch was simply a big joke. In the first moment, the churches in the empire were divided into two distinct factions. The School of Economics clearly stood on the side of Her Majesty the Queen, while the local faction loyal to Vala immediately raised the flag of rebellion after a short period of chaos. In short, the empire suddenly became a mess. This was not just an internal matter of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This huge change of interests affected everyone's heart. The nobles of Cloak Bay responded to the call of the Silver Queen immediately, but the nobles of the north obviously could not accept this fact. In fact, at this time, the two sides had already fought in the east of Metz. Surprisingly, the traditional military nobles were defeated and suffered a big loss. Brando could not learn more from these refugees for a while. He only knew that the coalition forces formed by several lords retreated in the direction of Ludwig after losing. But these were not the main points. The real bombshell was, the Myrnas were back. These survivors from the era of the Dark Dragon had finally risen from the ashes. When they heard the news, the supporters of Her Majesty the Queen, including Count Alcorn, could not believe it at first, then they doubted it. But after confirming it again and again, they fell into silence one by one. After all, this was still a world dominated by order after the War of the Holy Saints. No matter how unrestrained and rebellious they were, they dared not deny the justice of the four sages. This was the foundation of the Iron Folk and the noble ancestors. For a while, they could not figure out what happened to Her Majesty the Queen. Was she crazy? How dare she do this? But after a moment of silence, Brando knew that his opportunity had come. He hurriedly instilled his plan into the stunned nobles of the empire. In the case of an uncertain environment, it was best to stand firm first and then choose what to do next. It was probably because of such a huge change in the situation that these fleeing nobles no longer cared about such a small issue as taking over a port. Besides, Count Alcons and the others were not stupid. Of course, they knew what the best choice was when they were surrounded by powerful enemies, and the situation was uncertain. As for Brando's actions of taking over the port, they unanimously chose to remain silent. But Brando actually understood that choosing to remain silent at this time was actually supporting him. As the dust settled on the affairs in the port, the tasks were assigned one by one. Brando stood in the original office of Baron Ludwig Metz. Through the floor-to-ceiling arched window, he saw that there was not much commotion in Fatham Port outside. Everything was still in order. Finally, he could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. This time, the wizards of Buga had given him a huge problem. Now, he had finally taken the most difficult first step. Fortunately, Tullman did not lie to him. Her Majesty the Queen had indeed taken action first. In this way there were more options left for him. At least the interior of the empire was no longer a monolith. As for the matter of using the tiger's skin as a banner, Brando thought that the wizards of Buga would definitely not mind such a small matter. He could not help but think with some malice. These damn guys wanted to stay out of this matter, but he would not let them do as they wished. He wanted to let these wizards who thought that they were superior, understand that there was a price to pay if they wanted to use him as a chess piece. He knocked on the table just in time to see the Shire pushing the door open and coming in from outside. The young wizard attendant looked at his lord with a strange expression and said, "My lord, the weather is good today. There are some unexpected gains in the port." "Cut the crap." Brando's face stiffened and then he was slightly stunned. "Unexpected gains? Well, it's a big fish. Oh no, it should be a little mermaid. What kind of nonsense is this? A mermaid? I thought it was a siren." Brando frowned and was about to say something, but the Shire already knew what he was going to say and quickly interrupted him with a smile. "I'm not talking nonsense, my lord. You'll know when you see it." The light that penetrated the darkness was the only connection between this huge moving cage and the outside world. It came from the air holes above, and this beam of light scattered diagonally in the dark environment. It fell on the floor not far from Vahina, forming a circular spot of light. Her hands and feet were shackled with ice-cold shackles. The shackles were not heavy, but they were inlaid with formations that could isolate magic power. She calculated day and night based on the changes in the position of the light spot and the food she had obtained. It had been almost a week since she had been locked up in this cage, and almost half a month had passed since she had been imprisoned in Wagner City. Thinking back to when she was first locked in this cage, she was furious and wanted nothing more than to kill that despicable Rodney. But as the days passed, she became numb to it. After the rage, she felt a deep sense of unease and fear. But what Vahina was most afraid of was not her own fate. After all, she was the student of the Green Sword Saint Veronica. She would not kneel down and beg for mercy in order to survive. What she was most worried about was her family, her father, and her younger sister. If she still did not know who was behind this, then she would be a true idiot of a noble lady without the slightest bit of political intelligence. Oh. Chapter 984. After sorting out her thoughts, Vahina understood her situation. In the past week, the change in the time of sunset proved that they were heading north. There were a few times when she heard the sound of waves. There were a few mountain paths between Metz and the evergreen corridor that were close to the sea. This proved that the convoy was also heading west at the same time. It was very likely that the convoy was passing through a few provinces along the sublime inland sea in the west of Flower Leaf territory, heading to the port there and taking a ship to the imperial capital. Days passed by. Living in the dark was enough to drive a normal person crazy, not to mention the great fear buried in her heart. Most of the time, she bent her legs and buried her head in her knees. She hugged herself with both hands and curled up in the corner of the prison carriage as if this could make her feel a little safer. A day ago, the convoy stopped briefly at a small town on the platform east of Fathan Port in Naka. During the stop, she figured out where she was. The information revealed by the guards indicated that the convoy was heading to the west end of the Evergreen Corridor, which was also the starting point of East Metz, Fathan. Earlier that day, she clearly heard the sound of waves crashing against the cliff. She had walked through this mountain path more than once, but at that time, she came here as the daughter of a duke. Vahina leaned weakly against the cold iron wall. Strands of blonde hair hung down on her pale cheeks. She lowered her eyelids weakly, her thick eyelashes trembling slightly. The sound of seagulls could be heard outside the prison carriage. Strangely, the road was a little deserted. There was no sound of caravans passing by. In theory, this should be an important land and sea hub in East Metz. There was an endless stream of caravans on weekdays. Or perhaps Rodney did not plan to go to Fathan Port, but they had built a secret anchorage nearby. The girl suddenly felt a chill down her spine. These people were actually so cautious. However, that was not the case. The sun had just dispersed the fog between the straits, but the cliffs near the sea were still shrouded in a thin layer of water vapor. There was a pass in the middle of the misty water vapor. Rodney quickly stopped the convoy and looked up at the soldiers with anchor-shaped emblems on their battle robes on the city wall. The pass built by the mountains and the sea was the outermost line of defense of Fathom Port. Usually the gate was rarely closed, but today it was tightly shut. It seems that the war started by His Majesty has already affected this place. News of the Civil War had not yet reached these parts east of Metz, Rodney thought, but as the Queen's emissary he had first-hand information. He raised his head and shouted, "Open the door! Who are you people?" The soldier on top of the city gate tower poked his head out to ask, "We are from the White Legion. Our commander has urgent military matters to attend to at Fathom Port. I've already sent someone to inform you earlier. Didn't you see it?" The knight beside Rodney asked in annoyance. There was a commotion among the soldiers on the city gate tower, as if they were sizing them up to confirm their identities. This scene made Rodney even more certain of his thoughts. Usually these people were not so loyal to their duties. The so-called inspection was mostly to deal with the situation or to take advantage of the situation to gain some benefits. After a while, the people on the city gate tower seemed to have confirmed the identities of Rodney and his entourage. After all, Rodney's retinue was a real White Legion knight. They were riding on tall mountain land dragons. The land dragons were also wearing special armor with silver scales on their bodies. On the saddle hung a war flag with the white dragon emblem. Their spears shone brightly, and they looked dignified. At a glance, one could tell that they were not fake goods. Soon the city gate creaked as it rose. In the darkness, Vahina felt the cage shake slightly, and the convoy began to move forward again. She was still unaware of the battle that was happening in the east. She was slightly puzzled. Didn't these people bring her to the secret port? Why would there be a pass and a city gate? Even Fathom Port did not have such strict security. Brando, Eugenie, the Roman and the Shire were on the lookout tower, watching the convoy cross the drawbridge and pass through the city gate. Brando pointed at the knight at the front and introduced him to the other three. "That man is Rodney, Veronica's younger brother. He is the youngest son of Duke Arizik. However, this man is not very capable. At most he is a jester. After Lady Veronica was put under house arrest by the Silver Queen, this man drew a line with his family and won the Queen's favor. Now, he is the Queen's secret envoy. The Arizik family is full of heroes. I didn't expect them to produce such trash." The Duke's daughter wrinkled her nose in disdain. "You can't say that. This guy's ability to judge the situation and place righteousness before family is evident. He's just making the best use of everything. The Shire replied with a smile. My lord, you seem to be very familiar with this man? Brando did not comment on this question. In fact, as a player of Erewhon, he was quite familiar with the well-known figures of the enemy. However, this was not the only reason why he was familiar with this man. In history, Rodney was just like what the Shire said. He was famous for being good at taking advantage of the situation. His reputation made him like a fish in water in the upper circle of the Empire's nobles. At that time, people called him the twin pillars of the Arizic family. He and his sister Veronica were regarded as the pillars of the Arizic family, but no one knew that this man was a complete coward. In the War of the Year 41, Madara's army besieged White Eagle Fort, located in present-day Ludwig. He surrendered without a fight and sacrificed himself to the enemy, causing the White Legion to be almost wiped out. This was a famous scandal in the history of the Empire. Because of this incident, the prestige of the Arizic family plummeted. Even Veronica was implicated by him, and was removed from the position of Legion commander. Therefore, it was difficult for players from the future to not be familiar with this famous traitor's deeds. However, this weak and incompetent man was a perfect example of a useless teammate. But if he was an enemy, he was really lucky. Fortunately, this guy's reputation was not well known now. Perhaps even the Silver Queen did not know what kind of person her new secret envoy was. The enemy's misfortune was his own great fortune. Brando thought that the Shire was right about one thing. If used properly, this man in front of him would not only be a big fish but also a fat one. He looks quite decent. He's just a little bit worse than my Brando. The merchant lady's perspective was different from ordinary people. She squinted for a while before coming to this conclusion. Cough, cough, cough. Brando was almost choked to death by these words. What did she mean by look decent? The Arixico family had excellent genes. His sister Veronica was a famous beauty in the imperial capital when she was young. Rodney himself had perfectly inherited this bloodline, and was one of the most famous gigolos in the imperial capital. He was also an expert at picking up girls. It was said that he had an ambiguous relationship with many of the famous ladies in the imperial capital. In terms of appearance, Brando knew that he would never be able to catch up with Rodney. Perhaps only the Roman people would be able to shamelessly boast like this. He looked at the two people beside him in annoyance. As expected, he saw the Duke's daughter looking at him with a strange expression. The unscrupulous wizard servant was also having a hard time holding back his laughter. Laugh if you want. Be careful not to get internal injuries from holding it in, Brando said calmly. That won't be necessary. My lord, the Shire laughed and said. There are still people below. It won't be good if we attract their attention. Eugenie had a strict upbringing and quickly restrained her emotions. She clenched her fist and coughed softly. I heard that Her Majesty sent him to spy on the White Legion. Why would he suddenly appear here? Who's inside the cage? You hit the nail on the head, the Shire smiled and said. There's a mermaid inside. Mermaid? The Duke's daughter frowned. That's just a metaphor. The little beauty in the cage is actually the Lord's old lover, wha? The Shire screamed and dodged Brando's sword. My lord, you actually attacked. Those people are still below. Shut up. Brando coldly replied. In fact, he had already guessed who was inside the cage the moment he saw Rodney. Vahina had written a letter to him, and it clearly expressed her intentions. In fact, Brando had already expected that she would be in trouble, but the young lady had underestimated the problem. The fact that the Silver Queen had placed Veronica under house arrest and chose to support Rodney as the next head of the Arixico family was enough to explain many things. Rodney would never help Vahina out of respect for his sister, not to mention that he was a despicable person from head to toe. Unfortunately, it was too late for him to reply to Vahina. He did not expect that Rodney would fall into his trap after capturing Vahina. In fact, Brando had also wronged Vahina. The Silver Queen had sealed off information from the east and north much more strictly than the south. That was why Vahina did not receive any first-hand information, just like how she did not know about the conflict of interests between the Arixico family and the Silver Queen. Brendel watched silently as the carriage passed through the pass and entered the port. His heart was secretly filled with a trace of anger that was difficult to detect. No matter what, Rodney's actions had crossed his bottom line. The carriage finally boarded the ship. Rodney breathed a sigh of relief as he looked at the bustling scene in front of him. In fact, he was well aware of his status. In terms of ability, he could not compare to his sister. In terms of popularity, he was no match for the military nobles in the north. However, he was sufficiently loyal to His Majesty, and he had no qualms about placing himself in the position of a sycophant. Since he had already established his position, he had to help His Majesty with some things under the table. Not only did he have to do it, he had to do it well and not leave any traces behind. Just like what he did this time. Of course, he knew that he would offend a lot of nobles, but it was better for him to be the villain than for His Majesty to be the villain, because His Majesty would remember his contribution. As for the nobles who were past their prime, he did not care if he offended them. He knew very well what Her Majesty wanted to do. It was a great undertaking that was not inferior to the 4 wise ones. No, it was far better than what the 4 wise ones had done. Those decadent and ancient nobles would be burned to ashes in the new flames. It was the same for the Arihiko family. Rodney said to himself in his heart. He had no qualms about what he had done. It was a matter of course that he had to give up something in order to gain something. Thinking of this, he looked back at the prisoner carriage that was about to be transferred to the lower deck. He knew very well the value of the young lady in the cage. Although Her Majesty had taken action in advance and established a new doctrine on the ruins of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, she did not want to overturn the entire empire. Although the nobles in the north had been proven to be completely unreliable, there were still more nobles who were watching. Her Majesty had once told him how important the nobles in the east of Metz were. If they turned to the new doctrine, Ludwig and the other old fogies would be in a difficult situation. Not to mention, East Metz was the main route to the Alcash Mountains. Although he did not quite understand why Her Majesty valued the Alcala region so much, East Metz must be in her hands in order to enter the Alcala region. Among them, the most important chess piece was the Flowerleaf territory. The current head of the Flowerleaf territory was the Duke of Flowerleaf, Helix. He was a hardliner and was emotionally biased towards Ludwig and the other nobles. When he was young, he had lived in the Arihiko family for a long time and had a deep relationship with the previous Duke of Arihiko. Therefore, he would definitely not be biased towards Her Majesty. The 2 sons of the Duke of Flowerleaf were also representatives of the military nobles. The stubborn local faction was even more untrustworthy. Lastly, the eldest daughter of the Duke of Flowerleaf, Vahina, was extremely rebellious and was also the disciple of the Azure Sword Saint. These people were not suitable candidates. Now that the Duke and his 2 sons were under house arrest, and the young lady was secretly escorted back to the capital, the remaining little princess was known as the Little Angel of the Flowerleaf territory. She had been timid and obedient since young. With her father, brother, and sister as hostages, there was no need to worry about her disobedience. Once the Flowerleaf territory turned to the queen, East Metz would basically be half pacified. The remaining nobles who were weaker would most likely not wait and see anymore. As for the return of the Myurnas, Rodney was a little disdainful. This world belonged to the Myurnas in the first place, and the Iron People had only stolen the authority. Her Majesty the Queen was doing the right thing, and that was to put the authority back in its rightful place. And she would be crowned as the Dark Dragon as a Cruz citizen. When that time comes, the empire that ruled the land would reappear, and the people of Cruz would be on equal footing with the Myurnas. It was laughable that some people did not understand. This was a righteous cause. Vahina felt cold and hungry. For the past 2 days, she felt that the people outside were watching the prison van more closely. In the past few days, she still had time to breathe, but for the past 2 days, the people outside rarely opened the door of the prison van. Even the number of times they sent food and water had decreased. They would only send food and water once a day in the evening, which made her feel wronged and scared. In fact, Vahina faintly understood that it was because they were almost at their destination. That was how humans were. Whenever something was nearing completion, they would become increasingly nervous and highly focused in order to avoid failing at the last step. It also meant that she was not far from facing her own fate. This thought made her feel uneasy. She did not know what she would face. Would she be executed directly in secret, taken as a hostage, or used as a chess piece in a political marriage. She had heard of such things many times in the past, but none of them were the main characters. She only felt that it was a little scary. But today, she felt a great uneasiness gripping her, and she could not breathe. It was as if she saw a path that led to a dark abyss, filled with blood and despair. Vahina shivered as she snuggled against the cold iron wall. The past kept replaying in her mind. At that time, she was still the high and mighty princess of Floral Hill, deeply loved by her father and his majesty. No matter where she was the center of everyone around her. Then, she became Veronica's student and went to many places with her teacher. She once breathed in the air of freedom and could no longer live in a cage. She once thought that she was different from the noble ladies who were like canaries. They were weak and could only accept the fate of others, but she, who was like a young eagle, could choose her own future. Reality proved her naivety. All her fantasies turned into bubbles. She felt as if she had been deceived by hope, and then mercilessly abandoned. Tears dripped onto the floor like beads of a broken necklace. Vahina cried helplessly. As she cried, Vahina recalled the days in the loop of trade winds. It was her first adventure away from the empire, and she once thought that it was the most terrifying experience she had ever encountered in her life. A despicable country bumpkin not only humiliated her, but also taught her a lesson several times. Even His Excellency the Legion commander could do nothing about him. But compared to what she was experiencing now, it was not even worth mentioning. She even felt a faint warmth when she recalled it now. If only I could go back to that time. Vahina was quickly shocked by her own thoughts, and soon fell into lamentation over her current predicament. Brando. Vahina was a little feverish. Her scalding forehead was pressed against the cold iron wall, and her mind could not help but wander. It was as if these wild thoughts could dispel the worries in her heart. She suddenly remembered that Brando had already arrived in the Empire, and was just a stone's throw away from her. But he definitely did not know about her current predicament. Perhaps he still thought that she could help him and save his subordinates. But now, as the daughter of a duke who was once high and mighty, she could not even protect herself. Her future and fate were unknown. Perhaps she would die tomorrow, or perhaps she would drag out an ignoble existence that was worse than death. Oh, that girl called Vahina. I once went on an adventure with her when I was young, but it's a pity that I haven't heard anything about her for a long time. Oh, that girl called Vahina. I went on an adventure with her when I was young, but it's a pity that I haven't heard anything about her for a long time. Vahina's heart felt like it was being stabbed by a knife when she thought of this, and her eyes turned gloomy. Brando soon received news that Lodney's flagship had left the port. Just as he expected, Lodney did not even meet Baron Metz in order to keep it a secret. Being so cautious could be considered a skill. This also allowed Lodney to escape. Otherwise, once they entered the castle, Brando would order the net to be pulled back, and Lodney would not be able to escape even if he had wings. Now, he could only use the backup plan, which was to have the fleet stationed at the outer sea stop Lodney's flagship. It was not that he did not consider detaining Lodney in the port, but he had just taken over the port and had not dispelled the suspicion of the lower and middle officials in the port. It would be unwise to cause trouble at this time. Moreover, Earl Alcon had not decided to completely stand against the Silver Queen. At this critical moment, Brando was afraid of alerting the enemy, so he had no choice but to arrange the battle at sea. However, he was not afraid that Lodney would be able to escape. The warship that Rodney prepared was one of the fastest warships in the Empire's navy. Unfortunately, with such a conspicuous warship docked at the port, it was hard for the people of Aween to not notice it when they took over the port. Marjorie immediately reported this conspicuous warship to Seal. Navy warships rarely acted alone, especially this kind of fast warship. They were usually used to send messages or carry out some special mission. They quickly followed the clues and found out the traces of the messenger that Rodney sent to Fatine Port. In fact, it was through this method that they found out about the information about the convoy. Therefore, Brando had already arranged for someone to tamper with the ship. The quality of the magic crystal used as the floating warship's power source was changed, and some of the spare sails were removed. Lodney was in a hurry to leave the port, so he did not check it carefully. In fact, he did not think to check it because the warship had been docked at the port. Who would cause trouble for the Imperial Navy? And all of this had already doomed his ending. 3 Buga floating warships with red sails disguised as Imperial patrol ships had left the port early and were waiting for Lodny's flagship in the outer sea. Chapter 985. The battle to ambush Rodney's flagship ended faster than expected. Under such circumstances, even the backup plan that Brando and the others had discussed and arranged was not of any use at all. When the Valhalla fleet disguised as the Empire's patrol ships fired their cannons, Rodney thought that there was some kind of misunderstanding and hurriedly ordered the ship to stop and wait for Brando's subordinates to come closer to explain. In the end, when the 3 warships from Valhalla were close enough, he finally realized that something was amiss. Unfortunately, it was too late. The commander on Brando's warship immediately ordered the warships to approach and engage in a boarding battle. The sailors swarmed forward. Although the Knight of the White Legion around Rodney was still prepared to put up a desperate fight, the battlefield they were good at was not in the air. Not to mention, Brando's side had the Valkyrie and the Ash Sword Saint. In less than 15 minutes, the sailors had broken into the lower cabin and forced Rodney and the rest of his squires to surrender. After that, the 3 warships and the flagship docked at the military anchorage near Fathom Port. Brando was notified immediately and brought the Shire and the others onto the ship. When they boarded the ship, the traces of battle on the deck had already been cleaned up. The corpses that were strewn all over the deck were moved away, and the filthy blood was washed away. Rows of sailors in Valhalla Navy uniform stood on both sides of the ship, and there were obvious traces of battle on their bodies. However, most of these young people's eyes were shining with excitement. Behind them, a few captives were tied up like dumplings and thrown to the side. Rodney himself was not injured at all. He stood beside the cabin door, and the head of the Valkyrie, Brunhilde, was personally responsible for monitoring him. Brunhilde was dressed in military attire as usual. Her face was as cold as ever, and she had a serious smile on her face in front of outsiders. However, there was a bright flame burning in her light blue eyes. She only nodded slightly when she saw Brendel. Being personally watched by the head of the Valkyrie, who was praised in myths and legends, made Rodney's life worth it. However, at this moment he obviously did not think so. He did not want to die, so he appeared to be particularly nervous. He had witnessed the entire battle with his own eyes. He had brought 32 great knight commanders with him. These knight commanders were all elites from the White Legion, and each of them was at least at the lower gold level. However, these elites of the elites could not resist in front of the 3 female warriors riding flaming warhorses. Even the most euphemism to describe the previous battle was that the battle was one-sided, and there was no room for luck. In particular, the Valkyrie beside him had left a huge hole in the warship with a single shot. What a joke, this was a second-level warship. Although he did not have much ability, he had a good eye. At a glance, he could see that these Valkyries had at least mastered elemental power, and they were not half-baked people who had forcibly raised their power from the peak of gold to touching elemental power. They were genuine powerhouses who had mastered elemental power. Temple Knight commanders and perhaps even more. Why would 3 elemental rank powerhouses suddenly appear in such a place, especially when they were wearing standard equipment? They seemed to belong to some mysterious force. Rodney did not recognize the flaming warhorses they were riding, but to be able to withstand an elemental rank battle, this kind of mount was obviously extraordinary. He could not help but break out in cold sweat at the thought that such mounts could appear in batches. What kind of force in this area could be so powerful? Other than the Holy Cathedral, he really could not think of anything. The biggest lord in East Metz was the Duke of Flower Leaf, but even the Duke of Flower Leaf could not have such strength. Could it be the Holy Cathedral? Rodney knew that other than the clerics, the highest armed knight class of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was the Flame Knight, but there were no women in the Flame Knight class. Moreover, he could see that these people were obviously foreigners, but he did not connect them to the small country in the south. He suspected the most, in fact, were the Bugas. Only the Bugas would appear at this time and stand opposite Her Majesty the Queen. Rodney's wild thoughts continued until he saw a person appear on the deck. When he saw that person, he couldn't help but widen his eyes in disbelief. His face turned deathly pale and large beads of sweat oozed out from his forehead. His legs couldn't help but tremble as if he would collapse to the ground at any time. If Brunhilde didn't support him from behind, perhaps this possibility would have become a reality. From this it could be seen how frightened this guy was. In the Empire, if there was such a person who could cause such an impact among the nobles, then there was no doubt that this person could only be called the Ash Sword Saint or Mephisto, who was now on the deck with Brando. For this legendary sacred sword saint, his appearance could be said to be well known in the Empire. There was no need to explain because it was impossible for anyone not to recognize him, not to mention the nobles. When Brando saw Rodney's expression, he thought of the influence that Mephisto had caused among the nobles in the south of the Empire. He could not help but look at his cheap swordsmanship teacher with some curiosity. He thought to himself, how awesome must this sacred sword saint be to be able to make people so afraid when they have never met him before. Those who did not know might think that this old man had done something that angered the gods in the Empire. But it was strange. In his memory, the Ash Sword Saint had actually only caused trouble in the Empire twice. From the records, it did not seem to be a big deal. He did not know why these people were so afraid. Was it because they were too worried? Or there was something else hidden? Mephisto glanced at his student in disdain. He was too lazy to answer this kind of question. Although he hated the Empire for its destruction, he would not waste his time on a villain like Rodney. Of course, he knew why Brando brought him along, and now this guy had achieved his goal. He snorted from his nose and walked to the other side of the deck with one hand on his sword. He looked out at the sea and sky outside the port. Out of sight, out of mind. On the deck, the young people from Valhalla looked at him with admiration. Brando was a little speechless. He knew that his teacher's personality was different from ordinary people. He looked at Rodney and frowned slightly. To be honest, he did not have a good impression of this guy, whether it was because of what this guy had done in history or what he was doing now. Moreover, in the previous battle, he had lost more than 30 gold-ranked knight captains. What strength did his men have? Although they were trained by the Bugas, they had not trained for more than half a year. Even if they were gifted and had the help of the mass-produced inferior dragon blood potion, it would be amazing if they could reach the peak of iron rank in less than half a year. Even with the extraordinary strength of the Valkyrie, casualties were inevitable. And these casualties were unnecessary. These were the best young people of the kingdom who should have had a bright future, but they were bleeding and dying for no reason in a foreign country. It was all because of this guy who had caused trouble for him. When he thought of this, he could not help but feel angry. He wanted to throw this guy into the sea. But fortunately, Brando did not lose his mind. He knew that this guy in front of him was at least Veronica's brother, and although he was now working for the Silver Queen, at least he had not betrayed the Empire and joined Madara. Nominally, he had not severed ties with the Arazico family. More importantly, he wanted to squeeze some value out of this guy. Thinking of this, his gaze directly skipped over this guy and landed on Marjorie behind him. This young officer from the Yanalasu Royal Navy took the initiative to be in charge of this ambush. Considering that this officer was the most experienced among all his subordinates, and that this operation couldn't fail, he agreed to the officer's request and gave him 3 ships to be in charge of commanding. Fortunately, the officer didn't disappoint him and completed the mission beautifully. Marjorie put his hand on his chest and bowed to Brando with the etiquette of a subordinate. He replied, "My lord, with the blessings of the gods, I was able to complete the mission." Brando nodded and smiled. Well done. It was a simple sentence, but it made Marjorie feel a little excited. But then he realized that he was not in the Royal Navy, and the person in front of him was not his immediate superior. He could not help but be slightly startled. He did not know when it started, but this group of envoys had become familiar with the commanding tone of their commander. But after all, he was a naval officer, and obedience to orders had long been second nature. This thought only flashed through his mind, and he did not take it seriously. Eugenie, who was behind Brando, was keenly aware of the difference in tone between the two. She looked at Marjorie and Brando with a complicated expression. Brando glanced at the dark cabin door behind Rodney and cast a questioning look at Marjorie. The young naval officer understood tacitly and quickly replied, "My lord, the prisoner's carriage is inside. As per your orders, I did not let anyone near the cabin." Brando nodded in satisfaction. He did not want more people to know about Vahina's identity. Some things were better left in the dark than out in the open. Besides, he knew that with Vahina's temperament, She probably did not want too many people to see her in such a state. He felt a little complicated when he thought of the high and mighty young lady he met in the loop of trade winds. He thought to himself that this was probably what fate meant. Who would have thought that their second meeting would be under such circumstances? In the dark prison, Vahina was curled up in a corner, trembling. Cold shackles were locked around her right ankle, connected to a heavy chain. She did not know what was happening outside, but she clearly heard the roar of cannons, the sound of fighting, and the violent tremors of the ship. These noises were extremely noisy at first, but it reached its peak at a certain time, and then gradually died down. The entire ship became silent. At first, she could still hear the sound of doors being kicked open, heavy objects falling to the ground, begging for mercy and beast-like howls. But soon even these sounds disappeared. At first, she could still feel the floor of the ship shaking slightly, but later, even the entire ship became still, as if it had fallen into a completely silent world. Vahina didn't know that it was because the ship had docked at the harbor again. She only knew that the terrifying roar of the cannons had scared her so much that she clutched her head and screamed. She couldn't wait for this hellish experience to end as soon as possible. But when everything quieted down, she missed the noise from before. The endless silence made her feel as if her heart was frozen. She didn't know what was going on outside. It was as if she had fallen into a huge unknown outside the pitch-black space. The uncertainty about the future made the Duke's daughter feel as if a giant beast was lurking in the darkness ahead, waiting for her to run into it head-on. She could hear her own heart beating powerfully in the darkness, thumping as if it was the only sound in the world. Fear made her lean tightly against the cold wall. She also tried to call out in a low voice a few times, trying to attract the attention of the guards outside the iron prison. But because of hunger and cold, her voice was as weak as a helpless lamb, and could not be heard outside the iron prison. The great uneasiness finally made her sob softly. At this moment, the sound of metal scraping against metal pierced the dark world. Vahina bounced up from the ground as if she had been pricked by a needle. There were still some tears on her face, but she widened her eyes in horror as she looked around. The sound came from outside the cabin door, and soon, a second sound was heard. Vahina could feel all the hair on her body standing on end. She listened carefully and finally heard the sound clearly. It was the sound of someone opening the lower cabin door. She might be a young lady, but she was not ignorant. She knew that in a warship like this, only the engine room door was made of metal, and it was not far from the lower cabin. Is someone coming? Or is it something else? It was as if the beast hiding in the unknown was forcing its way into her. She could feel her little heart beating faster, and soon she heard a series of footsteps. The footsteps stopped not far from the prison, and she heard men talking. Pirates? That was the first thought that came to Vahina's mind. She knew that there were no airships in her father's territory, and even if they wanted to save her, they would not wait until the airship left the port. But who would fight the Imperial Navy in the Sublime? Could only be the pirates. She knew that the pirates had most likely won. Although she did not know who they were to be able to defeat the knight by Rodney's side, she had heard stories about them since she was young. She knew what would happen if she fell into their hands, especially a young lady like her. Vahina's face turned pale. She wished that time would stop at this moment and never move forward again, or that those boorish fellows would never notice this prison carriage. Unfortunately, things did not go as she wished. Soon she heard the sound of the prison door opening, a creaking sound that made one's teeth ache, and a strong light shone in from outside. Vahina immediately lowered her head and curled up helplessly in a corner. Her heart was at a loss. She was in complete despair. To her, this was the worst possible outcome. But there was only a fine line between heaven and hell. She heard a voice asking, "Vahina?" That voice was so pleasing to the ears, like the sound of nature. This rich young miss could swear to the heavens that she had never thought that that hateful voice would be so pleasant to the ears one day. It almost made her hallucinate, thinking that she was hearing things. She trembled and raised her head in disbelief. The light that seeped into the darkness caused her beautiful pupils to contract. Under her originally dazzling and beautiful blonde hair, which was now somewhat messy, her face was filled with an illusion of surprise and ecstasy. She saw the face that should never have appeared, but now it was right in front of her, so real that it couldn't be any more real. "Oh!" Chapter 986. The Shire walked up the stairs of the lighthouse. When he looked up, he saw Brando and the three ladies chatting by the railing on the side of the lighthouse. The Roman lady was giggling, and Vahina had a gloomy expression on her face. She seemed to have something on her mind. Maynard was dressed in military attire. She was leaning against the railing with her back facing the sea. Her long black hair fluttered in the sea breeze. In the distance, the sea and the sky merged into one. The floating clouds were like white mountains rising and falling in the sky. The others were already used to the female knight's silent and meticulous personality. However, they did not see the little Princess Cypher who liked to join in the fun. It seemed that she had dragged the little elf to the port to go shopping. The two ladies had now become best friends with each other. Of course, they did have a common topic and hobby, which was the ability to cause trouble. My lord. Brando was wearing a black knight's trench coat. The Halrangaya was hanging at his waist. The black rhinoceros leather scabbard was almost pointing to the ground. When he turned around, he noticed that his wizard servant had arrived. He smiled and waved his hand. You came at the right time. What do you think of the scenery here? The Shire was slightly startled. It seems that my lord likes the scenery here? Brando smiled and shook his head. He reached out his glove and patted the old and mottled outer wall of the lighthouse. Do you know the origin of this lighthouse? The Shire subconsciously looked up at the lighthouse. The old lighthouse looked old, but it was just an old lighthouse that could be seen everywhere in the sublime inland sea. He really did not know what this lighthouse meant. Fathom Harbor has a long history. However, my lord, I have never been here before. I don't know if there are any historical sites here, he replied. Ha ha! Brando laughed and proudly reached out his hand to the merchant lady beside him. The latter stuck out her tongue and reluctantly put a gold coin in his hand. She sighed and complained, The Shire, you are so useless. This lighthouse is the famous Tumun Lighthouse. Brando pointed in the direction of the harbor. Fathom Harbor was built in the year of the return of the light. The founder of the harbor was the famous scholar of the cruise, Fathom Freeman. The latter was a descendant of Tumun. He was also one of the few respected Myrnas in the mortal world. Unfortunately, this family could not escape the trial of time and eventually disappeared in the long river of history. This lighthouse was built to commemorate them. After all, Tumun was the bearer of the fire of civilization. He was the wise man who gave the light of enlightenment to the people of Black Iron in the darkness. Unfortunately, not many people can remember this history now. His gaze softened as he looked in the direction of the harbor. In his previous life, he had passed by this place when he left Aween for Farnazane. He remembered that there was an emblem of Farnazane on the door of this lighthouse. Even though it was a few decades earlier than that time, the emblem on the door was still the same. It was just that it was a lot newer. It was a very strange feeling. In both his previous and current lives, this harbor did not change much. He could even find bits and pieces of details from a few decades later. The memories of the past blended into these details, giving him a strange feeling in his heart. The Shire did not know whether to laugh or cry as he looked at his lord betting on him. However, Brando's words had also piqued his curiosity. He looked up at the lighthouse. This ordinary lighthouse was no different from the other lighthouses in the sublime inland sea. It stood between two headlands, overlooking the blue sky outside Fathom Harbor. It was like a lonely old man who had been through the wind and rain, silently and wisely watching the passage of time, leaving only the mottled green and white paint on its body. History formed a huge coincidence and completed a cycle. It had witnessed the decline of the last Myrnas, and now it was about to see them return to the world. So this is the origin of this lighthouse. It's actually not the original one. Vahina suddenly looked up and replied with a hint of pride. The original Tumun lighthouse was destroyed in a fire in 1914. It was rebuilt again, but the rebuilt lighthouse was damaged in the War of the Seven Moons. The one you see now is the second time it has been renovated. Brando turned to look at her, worry flashing in his dark brown eyes. After a night of rest, Vahina's complexion looked much better today. She seemed to have regained her pride as the eldest daughter of the Duke of Flowers. However, he knew that perhaps only by experiencing it himself could he understand what the past month meant to her. It was obvious that the shadow in her heart would not be so easily erased. The princess of the Duke of the Loop of Trade Winds, who did not know the sorrow of the world, was no longer around. Miss Vahina, you're trying to comfort me again. Vahina suddenly turned back and glared at him, her beautiful brows furrowed deeply. I don't want to quarrel with you, country bumpkin. I'm not as weak as you think. Also, she corrected him with a serious tone, call me Vahina. Brando stared at her with a frown, thinking that her tough act was no different from when she was in the Loop of Trade Winds. It was just that she looked silly and cute. The Shire laughed inwardly, but he did not forget that he still had business to attend to. He quickly reported, My lord, the interrogation is almost done. Oh. Brendel's brows furrowed slightly as he realized what news the wizard brought. In truth, it was not difficult to pry open Rodney's mouth, but the problem was how many secrets he knew about the Queen's secrets. What did he say? Brendel asked. The Shire hurriedly replied. As you expected, Rodney's main purpose is Miss Vahina. The Silver Queen hopes to use Miss Vahina and Duke Helix as hostages to force Miss Vahina's sister to submit to her. That way, she can gain control of the Duke of Flowers' territory. My sister is smart. She will never be controlled by that vicious woman. Vahina coldly interrupted, her fists trembling in anger. Brando gently patted her thin shoulder and asked, Other than that, where did the Silver Queen's Myrna come from? What does she plan to do? What other secret forces does she have? Well, the Shire shrugged. Rodney doesn't know much about that. But Her Majesty seems to be very interested in the Alkash Mountain. Her purpose of going east is not only to subdue the nobles in the northern part of the empire, but also to open up a passage to the Alkash Mountain. She still can't forget about the final battle? Brando was stunned for a moment, but he immediately saw the Duke's daughter trembling slightly. Only then did he remember that there were two main paths to the Alkash Mountain from the East Metz. One was in Ludwig, and the other was in the Duke of Flowers' territory. That. Why is the Queen so interested in that place? Romaine blinked her dark brown eyes and asked curiously. The Shire did not dare to neglect the question of his fiancée. He quickly replied, There are many reasons. Perhaps it's related to the secret of the final battle, or perhaps it's just because Her Majesty likes that place. Besides, the Alkash Mountain itself is strategically located in the middle of Fanzon, Saint-Tossel, and Cruz. It's a place where one can attack or retreat. What about the Myrna people? I don't believe that they came back from the Great Glacier like the rumors say. My lord, I've asked around. The Silver Queen's Myrna people are mainly the descendants of the witches. She mobilized the mountain people. Mountain people? To be exact, it's a branch of the mountain people, the Senia branch. Werewolves. Brando sucked in a breath of cold air. The mountain people lived in the Latch Mountains to the south of the Flowerleaf territory. But in fact that was before the last era. Due to various reasons, the mountain people left their homeland and spread their branches and leaves. Scarlet, for example, was a mountain person born in Erewhon. The mountain people had an unclear relationship with the Myrna people, which was why they were generally discriminated against in this world. Among the mountain people, there were a few bloodlines left behind by the Myrna people, and the Senia people were one of them. Now, the Senia people had long left their homeland like the other mountain people and settled in the south of Cloak Bay, in an unknown branch of the Broken Sword Mountain. That was the Silver Queen's sphere of influence, and it was possible that she could find these people from the last era. My lord, there's also this. We found it from the knight's body if I remember correctly. The Shire stretched out his hand and opened his palm, revealing a piece of rock lying flat in his palm. He then raised his head and looked at Brando with a strange gaze. Brando had already narrowed his eyes. This thing, lying flat in the young wizard's palm, was a gray piece of rock that was as flat as a chisel. There were no traces of artificial carvings on its surface, as if it was naturally peeled off from a huge rock. It was not the first time he saw this piece of rock. This was the gray shard. The first time he found something similar to it was in Amandina's father's belongings. The second time was in Kelsey's grave. The third time was in the remains of the crystal elk. And this is... The Roman opened her small mouth and let out a soft gasp. This is the fourth one, right? This is the fourth one. What exactly is this thing, my lord? I'm not too sure, but... Brando frowned slightly. Previously, when there were more than 3 of these gray pieces, He would put them together, and there would be an obvious resonance, forming something like a map. This time there should be a similar reaction. He signaled to the Shire, and the latter understood and gently pushed forward. The stone fragment seemed to be pulled by an invisible force, and stood upright in his palm. It emitted a faint blue light and slowly floated towards Brando. Brando immediately felt the other 3 pieces of rock on his body become restless, even though they were still in the dimension hole. Then the space also resonated. Maynard, who was leaning on the railing, seemed to have felt something. She turned her head and saw that the space between Brando and the Shire was slightly darkening, as if it was collapsing under a huge force. She could not help but be startled. "This is... my lord." The Shire's expression suddenly changed and he hurriedly shouted, "This is..." Like a drop of water falling on a calm surface of water. At that moment, Brando felt the existence of the Sea of Magic. The sky suddenly darkened. Above the entire sublime inland sea, from the west to the east, the entire sky was rapidly darkening. The clouds seemed to be driven by an invisible force and gathered from all directions. Lightning flashed across the clouds, and the rumbling of thunder rolled from the sky. For a moment, a new storm seemed to have formed above Xian High. The resonance of the space became more and more obvious. Even the ground was shaking, and small stones and gravel were dancing wildly. The snow-white walls of the lighthouse creaked and cracked, and a shocking crack appeared. Vahina screamed and held the railing for support. "It's dark, Brando." Roman looked at the sky in fear. A huge whirlpool was forming in the sky above Fathom. It was as if a terrifying eye had opened up in the thick clouds. Cold sweat slid down Brando's forehead. He could feel that his forehead was covered with sweat. "Take it back," he roared. The Shire did not even think about it. He grabbed the gray stone that was floating in the air. Strangely enough, the moment he grabbed the gray stone, everything suddenly calmed down. The clouds no longer gathered, the lightning disappeared, and the sound of thunder gradually faded away. The trembling of the space stopped in an instant. The sun once again shone in the sky, and the sea was no longer howling. Everything that happened before was like a terrifying illusion, but the huge crack on the lighthouse proved that everything that happened a moment ago was real. It just came and left. There was a lot of noise in the direction of the dock, and from time to time loud shouts came from there. "Is it an earthquake? Is it an earthquake?" But these voices were quickly drowned out by the cries and shouts. Brando, the Shire, Vahina, Maynard, and the Roman, the 5 of them stood by the lighthouse, frozen in their previous positions like puppets. Everyone was stunned. After a while, Brando was the first to recover from the shock. He asked a little dryly, "What was that before?" Everyone looked at each other. "My lord." "You don't have to say it," Brando interrupted his wizard servant, his mouth a little dry. "I felt it." "That is..." The Shire still had some lingering fear. "It's the tide of the Sea of Magic." Brendel recalled the terrifying feeling from before and answered word by word. "No? It's the dusk." The female knight's cold voice sounded at the right time. Brando was slightly startled and turned to look at her. The latter's face was also a little pale, but at least she could maintain her composure. She hesitated for a moment before answering with certainty. "It's the dusk dragon. At least for a moment just now, I felt a peeping from outside this world. But it's definitely not a demon. I have a hunch in my heart that it's there." Brando was silent. In fact, he also felt that terrible pressure. Even in the game, he had never felt it before. Did this thing summon it? The Shire carefully looked at the gray stone in his hand, sweating profusely, as if he was holding something terrible. "What the hell is this? I think it shouldn't be." Brando frowned. He faintly recalled the feeling of being peeped at. That huge power seemed to have broken through the barrier between the Sea of Magic and the wound in an instant and descended on the sky above Fathom Harbor. However, this passage was not opened by the resonance of the gray stone in their hands. Rather than calling it a summoning, it was better to say that it was a forced descent. On the outskirts of Nazir, a pair of golden eyes that looked like burning flames slowly opened in the darkness. The owner of this pair of eyes that was hidden under the branches and leaves suddenly sat up from the bushes, making a rustling sound. It was the 3rd day after leaving the Imperial City. Sydney subconsciously touched her chest. This action affected her wound, and she could not help but frown. The statue of the Saintess of the Lion Palace was no longer as elegant and calm as she usually was. Her face was covered with dust mixed with blood. But fortunately, at least that thing was still there, hidden under her thick clothes. This made her feel a little more at ease. She subconsciously raised her head and looked in the direction of the coastal area to the east of Metz in confusion. Why did the sea of magic suddenly become turbulent? What was resonating with this thing? A trace of doubt surfaced in her mind. Chapter 987. The rustling cold wind swept across the dry land of the plateau, and the sparse vegetation shook violently, bowing down to the cold and harsh monarch. Fawaz stretched out his snow-white paws and caught the snowflakes falling from the sky. Thin, sharp claws stretched out from under the fluff, flickering with cold light. It raised its head, and its eyes, as blue as the sea, reflected the entire northern sky and earth. It was such a picture. The mountains in the north of Anzaruta were like a giant door, lying at the end of the sky. On the open alluvial plain, the river was like a shining ribbon, flowing into the distance and converging under the undulating mountains. Heavy gray shadows curved curves and finally gathered at one point. It was a fortress, the last door leading to the evergreen corridor. Fawaz silently looked in that direction, and no one knew what thoughts were running through his mind. The cold wind blew the king of beasts' snow-white beard with brass rings, causing it to sway slightly. He turned his head, and the heavy armor on his body made a crisp clattering sound. Change the flag. Standing behind this wise and mighty Lion King were 2 rows of tall golden-maned forbidden guards. But among the crowd, there was an old lion man with a long staff and a red robe. He bowed his head and bent his knees, asking in a trembling voice, "Now? My respected Majesty?" Fawaz raised a finger, and the sharp nails flickered with a sharp cold light. He shook the finger gently. "Don't call me Majesty, Naze. Only that person can be called Majesty. She is the ruler of 1,000 realms, the King of Kings. She is the light of day, the color of night. The poem has long foreseen that she will rule the world. Now she has returned, bringing with her the gospel of all ages and the salvation of the lion men. You and I will serve her as if we serve our sovereign father." Modesty stared at the lion people's camp. Her vertical pupils, which were unique to cold-blooded animals, had a cold and narrow light. She immediately saw black flags rising from the endless camp, replacing the golden lion's main flag that was originally like an ocean. The female black dragon could not help but chuckle. It's an honor to witness the arrival of such an era. She spread out her hands, and pieces of black flag slowly rose behind her. On the flag, the holy emblem called a skort was shining. On the eve of the Year of Swords, the lion men of Toquinen, the lion men of the Golden Mane, passed through Rokizi, the broken sword mountain fortress. The army of Jorgandi Ridge captured the last fortress in the south of the Field of Four Territories, Azaf. The 2 armies met at the southern end of the Evergreen Corridor, and announced the change of banner at the same time. The black battle flag of the Empire, the symbol of the darkness dragon Odin, had finally returned to this land after disappearing for 1,000 years. The remnants of Cruz, the knight, and the nobles who fled to the north were lucky enough to witness the birth of this moment that changed history. When the news was brought to the north, it was quickly discovered that the supreme queen of the empire and the temple army that belonged to her side were flying the same flag. Thus, a rumor began to spread. After 1,000 years, the sovereign of the darkness had returned. She was both the sovereign and the father. She was the light that rose from the darkness. She was the sovereign of the previous era. She had returned, bringing with her the glory and redemption of the past. She would put an end to all these lies. The whole of Wond was shaken. As if there was a tacit understanding, the Red Army and the Wind Elves stopped fighting at the same time in the wilderness of the Four Realms. But then the elves fell into a dead silence. The Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress did not say anything for a while. The Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress, from the Holy See to the officiant, and from the royal court to the emperor, were collectively speechless. It was as if a terrible taboo lay in front of them, making them tremble with fear as if they were treading on thin ice. In Fanzan, the Sanners slowed down their southward advance. The nobles of the free cities looked at each other, not knowing what to do. The Holy Cathedral of Light, which had always avoided the darkness dragon, suddenly summoned all the regional bishops to White City and reactivated the Holy Parliament that was once abandoned after the War of the Holy Saints. But just when people were speculating that the church was going to send troops to the south to punish the crazy queen, the Supreme of Fanzan, His Majesty the Emperor and Pope Gloria II of the Empire, sent an edict to silence the noisy north. Order of the Silver Horse to return to the north of Al-Kash. All troops in the empire are not allowed to take a step south. The Holy Parliament is temporarily closed. No one in the Holy Cathedral is allowed to discuss the situation in the south. Thus, the sacred assembly that had reopened after 762 years was like the final radiance of the setting sun, dying just as quickly after its short revival. It had only lasted a short 12 days, and the Fanzans had jokingly called it the 10 Days Council. After a series of events, the only result left was the collective silence of the entire civilized world. It was as if the upheaval that happened in the Cruz Empire was just an illusion. Bang! Duke Wei Na heavily slammed the letter on the table. His trembling hand was proof of how furious he was. This senior minister of the empire looked around like a lion and roared. What good will it do them if they let the situation worsen? The generals around the sand table had different expressions. Some were furious, some were at a loss, and some were terrified. Just 3 days ago, Her Majesty the Queen's army had invaded West Metz. Her army clearly showed the order of the Highlanders and witches. At the border of the civilized world, it was said that many people had observed a strange group of humans. Everyone knew that the Myrna people had returned. Now the rumor that Her Majesty the Queen was the Darkness Dragon had been spreading like wildfire. Since she was 15 years old, she no longer looked old. Wasn't this the most direct proof? People originally hoped that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would stand up and take charge of the situation at this chaotic juncture. But now even the Holy Cathedral was divided into two factions. The two voices were fiercely fighting in the ideological world of the empire, making it difficult to distinguish who was right and who was wrong. However, as the situation on the battlefield became more and more inclined to the Queen's side, many fence-sitters had already turned to the scholarly faction. As for the northern nobles that the conservatives relied on, their days were getting worse and worse. Many of the conservative nobles were originally royalists, standing in the position of the legitimate heir. Since the Silver Queen began to make moves on the princes around her, they had been alienated from them. As the Silver Queen's actions became more and more crazy, they originally thought that these actions that offended the world would soon lead to her being betrayed. Especially when she reactivated the Xenia people and called herself the Darkness Dragon, the entire north was in jubilation. At that time, they could even imagine that Fanzan and Saint-Tossel would soon send troops to intervene, and maybe even the sage far away in the ring of the world would come to suppress her. Everyone knew that the world order established after the War of the Holy Saints was the cornerstone of mortal civilization. Anyone who tried to shake this cornerstone was going against the entire civilized world. And at this moment, this crazy Her Majesty the Queen stood on the opposite side of the entire civilized world. Her fate was obvious. The northern nobles were celebrating, thinking that victory was in sight, but the reality that followed shocked them. They were even at a loss. The silence of the Holy Cathedral of Light and the Holy Cathedral of Wind made their hearts drop to the freezing point. They even began to doubt their own worldview. What was wrong with this world? However, the silence of one side often meant that the other side was more arrogant. The nobles of Cloak Bay, who were still hesitating, instantly joined the Queen's camp. The imperial fleet, which had always been controlled by the Holy Cathedral, also fell into the arms of the scholastics. In addition, the Lion-men south of the Evergreen Corridor and the army of Georgandy Ridge suddenly changed sides. All of a sudden, the entire north fell into a situation of isolation and helplessness. Although the White Legion, which was entrenched in the north of the Evergreen Corridor, had not yet expressed their stance, everyone knew of their relationship with the Queen. In fact, the nobles on Ludwig's side had long given up hope in East Metz. They were even estimating the speed of the White Legion's advance. As news from all directions had long been cut off, they could only guess that Fathomport might have already fallen by this time. They just didn't know how long the Flowerleaf territory could last. However, the Duke of Flowerleaf was still under house arrest in the imperial capital. It was likely that his two daughters wouldn't be able to hold on for long. In this way, Ludwig was fighting alone. To make matters worse, The eldest son of the king had gone missing in Erewhon. The military nobles had lost their moral footing. If it weren't for the Silver Queen revealing her identity as the Dark Dragon and causing the Holy Cathedral to split, they would have probably become a group of traitors by now. In the crowd, an old man in a holy robe sighed. Duchess Weena looked at him and said angrily, "Bishop Randall, you tell us, are those damn tree sticks and northern barbarians still thinking of benefiting from the battle? Don't they understand what kind of situation they are in now? That crazy woman claims to be the Dark Dragon and intends to restore the rule of the Myrna people. She is blaspheming the sacred covenant, but those people are turning a blind eye to it. This is outrageous." Randall laughed bitterly. "You can't blame them. You and I are both people who experienced the last holy war. You should know what happened at that time. It's just that the things we saw at that time were too bizarre, and it made people suspicious." "But you are still standing here," the Duke interrupted him heavily. "Instead of throwing yourself into the arms of those traitors. This shows that it is only their weakness that has caused them to waver. Old friend, you can't say that. I can't prove that my choice is right. I just don't want to betray the belief I have for so many years. There is no right or wrong in history, only victory and defeat." The Duke waved his hand impatiently. "The War of the Holy Saints has been going on for 1,000 years since the Iron Folk took over this world. Is history wrong for 1,000 years because of this? This is nonsense. Only a lunatic would believe such a thing. At least, I will never admit it, and I will not let that crazy woman succeed so easily." "You are right, old friend." Bishop Randall sighed again. "What do you plan to do now?" "It's very troublesome." Duke Weena rubbed her forehead. "Militarily, we are in a very disadvantageous position. That crazy woman has an endless stream of trump cards in her hands. Those messy things come out of nowhere and beat us back. There is also the Lion Army in the south and those Earthlings. However, I am most worried about the Empire's fleet in Cloak Bay. If they head to the North Sea to block the sea route, then this war will really be impossible to continue." These words made everyone in the tent frown. This was the most realistic thing. The northern nobles, who originally controlled most of the Empire's military strength, were being beaten back by the Queen. They were about to lose the entire West Metz, and the betrayal of the Empire's fleet was a fatal blow to them. Now, most of the supplies in the north came from the sea route outside the North Sea. If the Empire's fleet headed north to block this supply route, then this war would really be impossible to continue. Duke Weena patted the map heavily and said, "I plan to ask the dragon race for help." "Dragon race? This is a way." Bishop Randall's eyes shot out 2 rays of light. The dragons were also involved in that incident back then. Now that the 3 traitorous dragons have appeared on the ground with great fanfare, the dragons will definitely do something about it. At the very least, they will make Jorgendy Ridge withdraw unilaterally. Otherwise, with the 3 dragons on the enemy's side, it will be too much of a threat to us. Duke Weena nodded. "This is not the key, old friend." He added calmly, "The dragons are not fools. They have already made their move. They might even know about this earlier than us. As far as I know, before that crazy woman made her move, they sent an envoy to the Empire. However, that envoy did not arrive in the Empire. It can be said that he was a step late. If the time is correct, this envoy must still be in the Empire." "Envoy?" Bishop Randall raised his head in surprise. "Why haven't I heard of this? Who is it?" "I got the news by accident, because the first person that the Dragon Clan contacted was actually the eldest son of the Emperor. It can be seen that they don't trust that crazy woman. As for who exactly they sent the envoy, I don't know. But I do know that it should be a silver dragon." "A silver dragon? That's a very high standard. This shows that the dragons value this envoy," Duke Weena replied. "Then we have to hurry and find this Lord Envoy. I have already arranged for people to look for him. Unfortunately, there is no clue at the moment." Perhaps the Duke's suggestion sparked Randall's thoughts. The bishop suddenly said, "What about the Buga people? They have always been on the same side as the dragons. Don't they have anything to say?" Duke Weena was slightly startled. It seemed that something was on her mind. Her expression became a little strange. "Speaking of these sly fellows, they did have something to say." "Sly fellows? Something to say?" Bishop Randall did not notice his old friend's expression. "What do you mean?" It's like this. I suddenly remembered about the Buga people 2 days ago. Then I found out that they had withdrawn all the diplomatic personnel just before that crazy woman made her move. But the Duke hesitated for a moment and continued. But they left me a letter. The meaning of the letter seems to be that they do not support that crazy woman's actions. They hope that we can stand our ground. We stand our ground. They are taking advantage of us. Those damn wizards want to get what they want. Everyone in the tent suddenly cursed. To put it bluntly, they just want to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. The bishop frowned. But the Buga people have been around for thousands of years. They should not be so naive. Can't they see that we are no match for Her Majesty? If this continues, we will lose sooner or later. Don't forget that being isolated from the rest of the world has always been their strategy. Duke Wei Na replied faintly. Randall nodded, but he felt that it was not that simple. At this moment, a messenger opened the tent door and walked in. Duke letter. Letter. Duke Weina was slightly startled. She looked at the letters from Fanzin and Saint Tossel in her hand and asked with a frown. Whose letter is it? I don't know, sir. But the letter came from the direction of Fathom Port. Fathom Port. The Duke was startled for a while before he remembered where it was. It was not because the place was too small, but because he did not expect it. He pointed at the letter and asked, This is a letter from the White Legion. Why did they send a letter? Are they going to change sides too? His words were full of disdain and sarcasm. But the messenger shook his head honestly. No, sir. I'm afraid it is not a letter from the White Legion. The person who sent the letter is Erwin's man. Erwin's man. This time Duke Weina was really stunned. Chapter 988. Brando looked at the grayish-brown stone on the table and was at a loss of what to do. Just 3 days ago, this inconspicuous thing almost caused a disaster. Just after the unknown pressure above Fathom Harbor disappeared, an earthquake occurred at the bottom of the sea not far from the harbor. The earthquake caused a small-scale tsunami, but fortunately, it did not cause too much chaos. Although it was very likely to be a coincidence, Brando knew that it was more likely to be caused by the previous tremors in the Sea of Magic. After all, this world was created by the elements bound by the law in the chaos of magic. It would really show the subtle changes in the Sea of Magic. But now it was lying quietly on the walnut wood desk. It was plain rough and did not have any magical reaction. No matter what method was used to examine it, there would not be any reaction unless you took out a few other pieces of it. Other than that, it was just like a normal rock on the roadside. If he had not seen its outstanding performance a few days ago, he would have thought it was just a normal rock by the roadside. If he had not seen its outstanding performance a few days ago, he would have thought so. All signs indicated that the pressure that appeared above Fathom Harbor 3 days ago was likely related to the Twilight Dragon. Although the pressure only appeared for a moment and did not appear again after that, Brando had experienced the later events of the Twilight Wolves in the game. He was very sensitive to the doomsday-like aura in the twilight. Although it was only for a moment, he was still keenly aware of the existence of this aura. Previously, when the 3 fragments resonated, they formed something similar to a broken map. But why would there be such a big reaction when the 4 fragments resonated? What was this thing? Why would it attract the attention of the existence in the chaos? Generally speaking, only the appearance of a divine artifact could cause such a big shock. Perhaps these fragments were related to a certain divine artifact? However, there were only so many famous divine artifacts in Wonde. The Scepter of Mountains and Rivers, the Blade of Supremacy, the Holy Book of White, the Glorious Holy Sword, and the Eternal Holy Spear. Brando eliminated all of them one by one. Even when the Azure Knight used the Azure Lance to pierce the heart of the Twilight Dragon, it did not cause such a big reaction, nor did it attract the arrival of the Twilight Dragon. Logically speaking, the Twilight Dragon should be more wary of the Azure Lance, shouldn't it? In other words, these 3 fragments belong to the Twilight Dragon. However, the Twilight Dragon did not have a physical body in Wonde. Its body only appeared in the chaos, and it was impossible for it to leave any relics in the material world. It did not use weapons, and the Twilight Dragon did not have any famous divine weapons. Brando was puzzled. Even the knowledgeable Silver Elf Princess didn't know the origin of these stone fragments. Senior Maynard also didn't have any impression of it. He even asked the silver dragon lady from the dragon race, but unfortunately, he still got a negative answer. This gray stone fragment seemed to have never existed in the history of this world. However, it was found by an unknown person. Brando remembered how he got the first fragment. It was next to the body of Amandina's father. It was placed in his belongings, together with the letter to Amandina. This was enough to show that Amandina's father was likely to know the value of this stone fragment. However, Amandina's father was born in a small noble family in Brax. His ancestors made military contributions in the war against the barbarians in the year of the croaking frogs. As a result, he was titled as a knight. Later on, there were several outstanding heads of the family. When the family's status was at its highest, it was once a baron. However, when it came to Amandina's father's generation, the family had already fallen. In the background of the game, Amandina's father was an adventure enthusiast, and also a part-time archaeologist. He was out exploring all year round and rarely returned home. When he died, it just so happened that in the process of an adventure, he was killed by the golden demonic tree. The Amber Sword was a game that paid great attention to details. If you looked carefully, you could dig out the story behind many quests. However, Amandina's father was considered ordinary in the huge background of the game, and could not even be considered detailed. Those well-known quests, which one of them did not have a background story behind it, were unearthed bit by the players, and not a single detail was left out. In the background of these quests, Amandina's questline could only be considered ordinary at best. Even in the game, Amandina's own storyline was much more detailed than her father's. After all, she was one of the main NPCs in Erwin's later game. But it was this person who was evaluated as ordinary by all the players, now that he was connected to this fragment that was very likely to be related to the Twilight Dragon in some way, and he did not casually put this fragment in his belongings. Amandina's father was very likely to have realized the value of this fragment. This was strange. How did he recognize it? Brando himself had the experience of 2 lives, and as a player he had traveled extensively in the game, and boasted that he was knowledgeable, and compared to the average person in this world, he knew more about some of the ancient documents. The little silver elf princess Medisha had experienced the War of the Holy Saints, and was a witness of that great history. She had a wealth of knowledge and experience. Senior Maynard's experience in the game was not inferior to his, except for the fact that she was slightly shorter than him in the game. She was even better than him in the game, unlike him who could only be considered knowledgeable after transmigrating to this world. She was famous for being a moving database in the game. In addition to the Silver Dragon Lady from the Dragon Clan, the Merchant Lady who had inherited the Witch Queen's knowledge, and one of the 4 sages who had left not long ago, the Wind Empress Saint Tossel, none of them could recognize the value of this inconspicuous fragment. But Amandina's father had recognized it. Brando couldn't help but deeply suspect the identity of Amandina's father. In the background of the game, he was just an ordinary fallen noble, but now it seemed that everyone had underestimated this NPC who did not leave behind a single line in the Amber Sword, and only left behind a letter that was passed down from his family. Brando suddenly remembered that even though he had talked to Amandina about her father a few times, he had never delved too deeply into it, mainly because he did not want this ill-fated girl to remember those sad memories, and also because he did not think that there were any secrets that could be uncovered from Amandina's father. I was careless." Brando couldn't help but nod his head. He raised his head and shook the bell on the desk. The door opened and Falerne walked in with a straight face. Ever since she became Medisha's night guard, she was even more rude to her previous master, Brando, but she was still able to fulfill her duties as Brando's personal secretary. Brando saw that there was a little tale behind Falerne. It was not her sister Tia, but the Roman lady. The merchant lady was used to coming uninvited, and she winked at Brando. Before Falerne could speak, she spoke first. "Brando, I have something to talk to you about." "What do you want this time?" Brando asked with a frown. It was not that he was not happy to see his fiancée, but the Roman seemed to be particularly interested in the stone fragments that could cause the sky to change colors. There were a few times when she wanted to trick him into giving it to her. How could Brando be at ease with giving her this thing? Wouldn't that be the same as giving a time bomb to a terrifying breakup? He would definitely not do such a stupid thing, but the merchant lady's ability to pester people was unparalleled, to the point that he would have a headache whenever he saw her face. "This time it's official business, Brando," the Roman said with a smile. "The witches seem to be saying some strange things." Brando's face became serious when he heard this. This day had finally come. The Wind Empress had already told him that there was more than one inheritance of the Dark Dragon, and the witches only listened to the legitimate heir of the Dark Dragon. However, there was still a huge disagreement in the witches' kingdom about who was the legitimate heir. The witches in Erwin's territory were more inclined to Brando's side. One should never underestimate the witches' influence in Erwin's territory. In the game, Erwin had another name which was known as the Kingdom of Witches. Although Erwin was small, there were several important witches in its territory. For example, the legitimate heir of the Dead Moon Branch, Ifiro, the legitimate heir of the Dead Moon Branch, Sugarpot, the legitimate heir of the Dead Moon Branch, and the successor of the Dead Moon Branch, Supreme Witch Micaiah, who was also the little lowly Brando met in Shallow Water Town. In addition to the legendary Witch of the Harp Moon, there were 4 legitimate inheritances of the witch branches in this small kingdom. The strength of the witches in this kingdom was evident. Moreover, these 4 witches' inheritances were not ordinary inheritances. Almost all of them had the highest status in the kingdom of witches. Among them, the witches of the Dead Moon were the guardians of the kingdom's law. Their status was second only to the Witch Queen and the Witch of the 13th Moon, the Black Moon, which only existed in myths. The witches of the Dead Moon were known as rebellious witches. The ideology of this inheritance was often contrary to other witches, and could be said to be deviant. However, there were often shocking experts in this inheritance. For example, Micaiah, who later became the Supreme Witch, and her teacher, False Queen Aska. As for the witches of the Harp Moon, the most mysterious prophet, Brando once suspected that they were likely to be his Roman aunt. This inheritance was not famous in history, but it was very famous in the Kingdom of Witches because they were the earliest followers of the Dark Dragon. Finally, there were the witches of the Dead Moon. Brando witnessed the Battle of Sugar Pot with his own eyes. This witch's inheritance was already the worst in Erwin's territory. Not to mention, Brando later found that the Witch Queen's inheritance was still in Erwin. In fact, he even suspected that the inheritance of the 4 witches in Erwin was most likely arranged for the Witch Queen's inheritance. In this life, Brando obtained the Dark Dragon's inheritance relatively early. In addition to his previous performance, the voices of the witches in Erwin's territory had the upper hand in the Kingdom of Witches. Because of this, many witches from other countries even came from afar to seek refuge with Brando's forces. Some of the witches he later accepted came from Fanzan and even the edge of the Great Glacier. For example, the bloodlines of those remote inheritances. However, the voices of the witches in Erwin's territory had the upper hand, but it did not mean that there were no other voices. In fact, when Brando's power was at its peak, most of the forces in the Kingdom of Witches were still conservative. After all, the Dark Dragon's inheritance was divided into several parts, and Brando only obtained one part of it. In addition to the conservative forces, the biggest voice of opposition came from the witches in Cruz's territory. These witches had obviously followed the Silver Queen long ago, and they obviously believed that the person they followed was the true Orthodox. But before this, the conflicts between the witches were still lurking under the surface. However, it could only be regarded as a turbulent undercurrent. On the surface at least they had not fallen out with each other. But this superficial peace only lasted until the Silver Queen revealed her true identity. Just a few days ago, Brando had heard about the Jorgendi Ridge's army, and the Lion Men's army changing flags. 1,000 years after the War of the Holy Saints, the flag of the Myrnas was once again flying on the earth. This incident had obviously given the witches in Cruz a shot in the arm. Moreover, there were various signs that indicated that the Silver Queen was likely to be the true Orthodox Dark Dragon. First of all, this queen held at least 2 inheritances in her hands, and there might be more. Even the current Brando was only on par with her. But the key was that the Silver Queen obtained Odin's inheritance from the battlefield of the final battle. She knew more about the history of the past, and the path she was taking was obviously the one that Odin had taken. And all of this showed the legitimacy of this queen. These days, Brando had learned from various sources about the surrounding areas of Fathom Port. There were many suspicious people who had appeared. Most of these people were the mountain people, the Senia people, and even some people had seen the legendary black-haired, golden-eyed Myrnas. These people mostly came from one place, the Great Glacier. They only went to one place, the capital of the Cruz Empire. There were various signs that indicated that the Dark Dragon had revived. The empire that was once above the entire world was reviving. This was undeniable legitimacy, just like the black flag that the Silver Queen Constance had raised. Such changes would naturally have an impact on the witches' kingdom. The biggest change was that the witches' support for Brando had gradually begun to lean towards the Queen's side. Even many of the previously conservative forces had begun to make a choice. This was news that Brando had already known. In fact, Sugarpot and Babasha had already warned him. And now, from what Miss Merchant said, even the witches who had originally sought refuge with him had begun to waver. This was not a good sign. Brendel furrowed his brows. Chapter 989. Roman was usually not very interested in the affairs of the witches, and rarely bothered to deal with them. However, she had the former Witch Queen's contracted spirit, White Mist, by her side. White Mist believed that Romaine was the successor chosen by the Witch Queen, and that she was the person who would be in charge of the entire Witch Kingdom in the future. As for the Witch Queen, in her opinion, she was just a usurper who held the seal. In fact, there was nothing wrong with this statement. In history, after the Witch Queen died, there was no designated successor. The power of the witches was safeguarded by her maid when she was alive, and she became the regent in name. After the First Era, even the word regent was rarely mentioned, and the title of Witch Queen was directly used. However, the witches had a long history, and there were many witches in the Bunasan kingdom who knew about this. Since this was the case, White Mist certainly could not allow the power of the witches to fall. However, Romaine's interests were all in business, and she could not persuade her, so she had to do it herself. As a contracted spirit who had lived for thousands of years, she actually did the same thing when she was by the Witch Queen's side. Now that she was facing these juniors, she was naturally familiar with it. With her unique background, she quickly subdued Babasha and her people, and planted a series of spies among the witches who were under Brando's banner. In this way, as soon as there was an unstable factor among the witches, White Mist got hold of the news and woke Roman up. Although Romaine never cared about her subordinates in name, she knew the importance of these witches to Brando, so she put down her own matters and rushed over, which led to her meeting with Falerne. According to White Mist's information, the main cause of the change in the witches' camp was Anwen and her witches of the Moon of Cup. She and the witches of the Moon of Sword were introduced by Babasha to join Brando's banner, and could be considered as the earliest batch of witches to join Valhalla. Brando listened to Roman's description and thought of the two women. He could not help but frown deeper. He originally thought that the witches were just playing tricks, but the problem was more serious than he imagined. Even the witches who joined him first had other ideas, not to mention the fence-sitters who joined later. White Mist also specifically mentioned Anwen's background. The witches of the Moon of Sword were mainly active in the north of Erewhon. There were actually many Cruzes people in this witches' camp, and they had a deep relationship with the witches of Anzaruta. In fact, the witches who joined him in the Silver Bay area were introduced by Anwen. The Silver Bay area was east of Anzaruta, and there were a series of loose principalities and city-states. Almost all of them were vassals of Cruz and Saint Tassol. There were a few witches with a long history here. Brando originally hoped to use them to get closer to these small countries, and open up the passage from Erewhon to Saint Tassol, to achieve the goal of suppressing Cruz. However, now that Anwen had sided with the Silver Queen, these witches were naturally unreliable. Fortunately, according to the information obtained by White Mist, the witches of the Moon of Sword had not been affected. Brando remembered the middle-aged witch named Krull. When he first met her, she did not leave a deep impression on him. He only remembered that she was a tall and thin middle-aged woman who always wore a hood and rarely showed her face, as if she had no interest in anything. When she first came to meet him, the nominal Dark Dragon, under the introduction of Babasha, she also had an indifferent expression and was not as enthusiastic as Anwen, even if it was only on the surface. Brando subconsciously knocked on the table with his knuckles. He was suddenly a little curious about this witch. The witches of the Moon of Sword were not like the witches of the Moon of Sword that Babasha and Sugarpot belonged to. As the witches who first joined him and had personally witnessed him display the power of the dark dragon, Babasha and her people were his natural allies and also his most reliable subordinates. There was almost no possibility of them betraying him. However, the witches of the Moon of Sword were different. Their relationship with him was even more estranged and could not be compared to Anwen and her people. Brando could not help but feel a little strange. Why was it Anwen and not Krull at this juncture? Was it because Krull and her people were too slow and did not realize it? Brando shook his head in his heart. He felt that this reason could not convince him. Although the deeds of the Silver Queen were not widely spread across the entire continent, it was spreading at an astonishing speed from Metz, Cloak Bay, and Ludwig to all directions. Now, even people in the south of Fanzon and the Great Glacier had heard about the news of the Dark Dragon's reappearance. As the center of the storm, how could Krull's people not care? Moreover, they were the witches who were most closely related to this matter. Then the question was, what was it that made Krull and her people fearless and not worried that they had sided with the wrong people? To be honest, Brando felt that the queen who was far away in the imperial capital might be the true inheritor of the Dark Dragon. This was because he had never thought of using this identity. In his opinion, Odin was Odin and he was himself. Although he had received the inheritance and power from the Dark Dragon, so what? Just as the Wind Empress had said, there was no good or evil in power. What was important was the person who used the power. He had grasped the power of the Dark Dragon, but he was still Brando. The path that he wanted to walk had always been his own, and not the so-called path of the Dark Dragon. In fact, he had never thought of changing the entire world. Since that was the case, Brando really couldn't find a reason why Krull and her people were so confident in him. Perhaps it was hidden too deeply, or perhaps there really was another reason. But no matter what the reason was, this middle-aged woman's strange behavior had attracted his attention. At this moment he already had the thought of meeting her, but not now. Brando quietly waited for the Roman to finish speaking. After the merchant girl finished speaking, she was surprised to find that he didn't express any opinion. She couldn't help but blink and curiously asked, "Brando, what are you going to do?" Brando glared at the eccentric merchant girl and replied with some annoyance, "These are all your subordinates. Now that such a big mess has happened, you still run over to ask me what to do? White Mist often told me that you don't care about things at all." Now it seems that she wasn't wrong. The Roman had a rare moment of embarrassment and explained, I'm not interested in them. They are the ones who seek refuge with me. No, they seek refuge with you, Brando. Furthermore, I don't want to be some witch queen. That auntie buried under the mountain is really too much. I just want to learn her fun witchcraft. She didn't even give me a heads up and made me some witch queen. White Mist is so annoying. Even my aunt wasn't as fierce as her. Brando's forehead was filled with black lines. What did she mean by, I just want to learn her fun witchcraft? If the witch queen knew that the Roman called her an auntie buried under the mountain, she would probably be so angry that she would come back to life. Besides, White Mist was a contract spirit that had lived for more than 1,000 years. She was forced by the merchant girl to the point that she couldn't deal with the younger generation personally. In the end, she was called too fierce. Who knew if White Mist would secretly cry in the middle of the night? He didn't know if this was the so-called bad judgment. Anyway, Brando felt that the Witch Queen definitely didn't think deeply before choosing the merchant girl in front of him as her successor. Of course, it could also be because she was impatient from waiting for too long, and the merchant girl just happened to bump into her. Of course, Brando forced himself to take back this ridiculous idea. He broke out in cold sweat and said to the merchant girl, forget it. I know. It's not your fault. Don't worry about the witches. I have my own arrangements. You can contact your old customers without worry." Hearing that Brando wasn't going to hold her responsible, the Roman couldn't help but feel a little happy. She quickly replied with an "oh" and obediently stood back. At least there was one good thing about her, which was that she trusted Brando completely. Although Brando never said how he was going to deal with this matter, in the Roman's heart, as long as Brando agreed, then there wouldn't be any problems. She originally thought that she had gotten into trouble again, and was a little flustered. She was afraid that Brando would find trouble with her, but now that she had escaped a disaster, the merchant girl couldn't help but be exultant. She didn't seem to be worried about the current situation at all. As for Brando asking her to contact the old customers of Abes in the Empire, this was actually her job. She knew that Brando was secretly contacting the nobles in the Northern Empire. Long before the outbreak of the Holy War, there were many merchants in the Empire who had trade relations with Erewhon. Originally, Erewhon and crews had an important sea route on the Shining Sea. After Brando made a name for himself in Abes, this sea route became busier and busier. It even surpassed the #1 commercial port in the Southern Territory before and after the Battle of Ampere Seal. During that time, although the Empire and Erewhon had always been in conflict, the trade with Abes had never stopped. Roman had also made friends with many big merchants in the Empire through her outstanding performance in the business field. Otherwise, she wouldn't have specially invited the Silver Queen to join the diplomatic team. Although Brando had always been suspicious of this so-called invitation, but later, with the disappearance of the eldest son, the internal situation in the Empire became increasingly tense. Brando's dealings with the merchants of the Empire, especially Ludwig and Metz, were shrouded in a layer of thick political color. After all, in this era, it was usually said that big merchants and big nobles were not separated. The output of the manor owner was usually achieved through business. Therefore, many business tycoons had the shadow of nobles behind them, or were nobles themselves. For example, Brando was the Lord of Abes and also the actual manager of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild in Abes. Roman was just his fiancée's proxy. In fact, such a combination wasn't rare in all parts of the continent. The nobles either did business themselves or through agents. Therefore, the trade between countries often had deep political undertones. The simple business dealings in the early stages of Ferber Hill's development were a rare phenomenon. After the disappearance of the eldest son, Brando, Veronica, and Mangrove, the head of the Black Legion, had actually formed an alliance. Veronica mainly wandered around the imperial capital, seeking supporters in the center of power. Mangrove operated Ludwig as the model and banner of the military nobles. Brando began to consciously contact the nobles in the north, mainly through the Roman Channel, exerting influence on the commercial level and seeking more allies. This plan had been in progress for quite a long time, almost half a year now, and the results were quite fruitful. After all, Metz and Ludwig were originally the traditional sphere of influence of the military nobles. The Abes that Brando belonged to only played the role of threading the needle. Veronica and Mangrove could not fulfill this role under the eyes of the Silver Queen, but the Queen probably never dreamed that the lord of a small kingdom thousands of miles away dared to plot against her. Today for Brando it was the season of harvest. Brando saw the merchant girl's eyes darting around without a word and knew what she was thinking. He shook his head slightly. Although the turmoil of the witches was still a problem for him, it was actually not the most important thing at the moment. After he calmed down, he actually had a plan in mind. Of the 3 witches' inheritances that had sought refuge with him, at least 2 would stand on his side, and the remaining one would not be able to cause any trouble. That woman called Wei, the current successor of the Witch of the Moon Cup, wasn't considered an outstanding figure in history, but she was rather famous. It was just that she was famous because she was the stepping stone of that famous arrogant woman, the Supreme Witch Micaiah. Who would have thought that in 2 lives, this woman actually hadn't made any progress at all? After all, history was inevitable. Brando suddenly thought of this sentence, and he could not help but think of the little girl he met in Shallow Water Town. He shook his head, expelled this thought from his mind, and looked up at Falerne. But before he could open his mouth, the icy wild elf lady had already spoken first. "My lord, what I want to say is similar to the Roman lady, but the target is different." Falerne paused for a moment and stared at Brando, as if she was disappointed in him for not living up to her expectations. "I want to talk about those cruise people." Oh. Chapter 990. The Kurlutz people that Falerne was talking about was naturally a group of Kurlutz southern nobles led by Count Alcon. Since they arrived at Fattanport, these southern nobles were still quite well behaved at first, probably because they knew that they were already tied to Brendel's boat. The army of Jorgendy Ridge and the Lion Beastmen in the south could attack the Evergreen Corridor at any time, and if they didn't hold onto Oween's fleet tightly at this time, wouldn't they be courting death? Coupled with the news of the civil war in the Bankel area, the Queen had split the Holy Sanctum and suddenly claimed to be the successor of the Darkness Dragon, which made them feel at a loss. Thousands of years of deep-rooted beliefs had suddenly collapsed, and no one could accept such a thing. Therefore, at the beginning, Count Alcon and others were considered to be united against a common enemy, and obediently restrained the low-level officials who managed Fathom Port. On the other hand, they actively contacted the northern nobles, trying to find an alliance to resist the crazy queen. However, as the situation of the war took a turn for the worse, the nobles east of Metz could not resist the queen's army at all, and they were defeated one after another. It seemed that almost in an instant, the army of the new Holy Sanctum had arrived at the door of Ludwig. Although they had not yet fought with the Black Legion, they already had a great advantage in the situation. Coupled with Veronica's house arrest, the Azure Legion was slow to respond to the uprising of the northern nobles. So soon, people could often see the remnants of the defeated nobles on the front line of Fathom. Various versions of the rumors also spread. First, the nobles of Cloak Bay defected. Then a few unfamiliar armies suddenly appeared under Her Majesty the Queen. Today, the Senia werewolves attacked Motohabi Castle, and tomorrow the mountain people swore their allegiance. There were even rumors that even the Azure Lance was in the hands of Her Majesty the Queen. All signs showed that the strength of the Empire's Empress was increasing day by day at a speed visible to the naked eye. It was as if the Silver Queen, who was alone at the beginning, had occupied 1/3 of the Empire's sphere of influence in the blink of an eye. At this time, the new Holy Sanctum was already a behemoth that could not be ignored, even suffocating. As a result, the southern nobles, who were not firm enough, began to waver. However, this wavering was only spread among the lower class until the sudden change in allegiance of the Lion people, and the army of Jorgendy Ridge gave them a fatal blow. In fact, Count Alcorn and the others did not have any real feelings about the civil war in the north. Because Brando had tightly sealed off the port, the first-hand news they received was almost all from rumors. These rumors could make people panic, but it was hard to say how real they would be. However, these nobles' fear of the Lionmen and Jorgendy Ridge's army, especially Jorgendy Ridge's army, was deeply rooted. They had witnessed how the army destroyed their homes, drove them out of their own land, and made them live in exile like refugees. They even had to live under someone else's roof. If it were not for Jorgendy Ridge's army constantly threatening the Evergreen Corridor in the east, why would they be trapped here? But at this moment, the Lionmen and Underground Lords had clearly expressed their support for the Dark Dragon, and the situation became a little delicate. Who was the Dark Dragon now? She was no longer the Myrna Emperor from 1,000 years ago. She was also the Silver Queen, a citizen of Cruz. Although the nobles cared about their beliefs, they ultimately cared more about their identity as citizens of the Empire. This was the guarantee of their status and the source of their pride. Survival was the most important thing, but status and power were also what they pursued. Before this, they couldn't have their cake and eat it too. But as the situation changed, the nobles who fled from the south suddenly realized that the answers to these two choices seemed to be gradually merging into one. What should they do if they wanted to keep their lives and status? At least for now, surrendering to Her Majesty was the only possibility. No matter what, she was at least the Emperor of Cruz. Although she had divided the Holy Sanctum, she could still be considered as the legitimate ruler. Subtle changes quickly occurred in the hearts of these fugitive nobles. Even the upper-class nobles, including Earl Alcorn, began to gradually lean towards the side of surrendering. At this moment, Brando's disadvantage as a citizen of Erewhon was particularly highlighted. Before this, he could still ask these nobles in the name of their beliefs. The Holy Cathedral of Fire was a religion that transcended countries, and had been deeply rooted for thousands of years. Although there were huge differences between Erewhon and Cruz, they at least had one thing in common. That was, they had the same beliefs. In the name of religion, it often made people ignore the differences between countries. But this reason soon became untenable because after the threat to their lives disappeared, the new religion established by the Silver Queen seemed to be less unacceptable. The difficult choice in this war had quietly become whether to reform or remain conservative. People seemed to intentionally or unintentionally avoid the Silver Queen's identity as the Dark Dragon. In fact, Brando was very clear that the current situation was ultimately caused by the lack of legitimacy of the nobles in the north. After all, regardless of the identity of the Silver Queen, she was at least the Emperor of the Empire. Although she had divided the Holy Cathedral, she did not betray the Empire. Simply put, the woman intended to put the royal power above the religious power. Although this approach was somewhat heinous, It was not unacceptable for the nobles. Perhaps, except for those who were loyal to the Holy Cathedral of Fire, no one would be willing to go against the queen on this issue, especially in a situation where their lives were in danger. The nobles in the north stood against Her Majesty because they were supporters of the eldest son of the emperor. However, the exiled nobles in the south did not have such scruples. Even if some of them were loyal to the Holy Cathedral, now that the Holy Cathedral was divided into two, who would they be loyal to? Therefore, this war was not on the side of good and evil, light and darkness from the beginning. It was just a pretense. This was a civil war. Brando had always been very clear about this. Although he had used this reason to fool Count Alcorn and the others for a long time, the nobles of the empire were not stupid. It was time for them to react. It was time to give them a strong dose of medicine, Brando thought. He quietly listened to Falern's explanation. In fact, what the wild elf girl wanted to say was similar to what he had imagined. At least, it was not as unexpected as the internal strife of the witches. He even felt that the southern nobles were a little too slow. Perhaps they were scared out of their wits by the Georgiandy rich people or some other reason. In his opinion, they should have made a fuss long ago. However, he was not worried. After Falern finished, he asked calmly, "So what are they doing now?" The wild elf girl was slightly taken aback. She could not help but frown. In her opinion, the current situation was caused by the negligence of the count in front of her. In these days, Brando did not strictly control the news, nor did he prevent the nobles from escaping from the front lines to enter the port. He only prohibited them from leaving. The nobles of the Cruz people also did not restrain them. Could even be said that they did not do anything. Other than maintaining the normal operation of the port, they probably sent messengers to contact the nobles in the north, and the rest was to study the useless stone all day long. When she thought of this, Falern felt a sense of disappointment. She felt that the count in front of her had been idle all day since the establishment of Abes. Even though Erwin had made great achievements in her opinion, it was only because of good luck. Or it could be said that it was all because of Amandina and the Roman girl's ability. Otherwise, it would be a problem for the territory to operate normally. She thought that after he became the count of the kingdom and also the leader of this diplomatic group, he would be more restrained. She did not expect him to be the same. He only knew how to push things to his subordinates. She was afraid that she would be better off as a count like this. Moreover, he was a planeswalker, the one who was in charge of them. This was worlds apart from the master in her mind. Falern could not help but snort heavily. What else can they do? The fleet is right above their heads. Do you think that those useless people will revolt? Of course, they are clamoring to see you, my lord. In their eyes, you are the only one who is easy to talk to. Hearing the resentment in the girl's voice, Brando smiled bitterly and shook his head. However, he was still a little surprised by the weakness and incompetence of the southern nobles. He thought that they would at least be a little more forceful, but he did not expect that Count Alcon only wanted to negotiate with him. Since they want to negotiate, Brando sneered in his heart, then let's do as they wish. He raised his head. Where are they? They are outside. They have elected a few representatives, hoping to negotiate with you. Falern replied with a straight face. Negotiate? Brando was a little amused. What do they plan to do? What do they want to talk about? Falern sneered. According to them, since Georgiandy Ridge and the Lion Beastmen have submitted to the Empire, then what's left is the Empire's civil war. My lord, it is no longer suitable for you to continue to interfere. They suggest that my lord send the fleet back to Erwin. Of course, my lord, you can still continue to go to the capital as an envoy. Oh, then what about the Silver Queen claiming to be the Dark Dragon? Brando deliberately asked. Falern's face suddenly became a little strange. It was obvious that she was trying hard not to show too much disdain. She replied. They said that this matter is too ridiculous, and it might be a rumor. Haha. Brando could not help but laugh. What a rumor. He paused for a moment and knocked on the table. If that's the case, let them come in and see me. Okay. Falern blurted out, but then she was stunned. She raised her head and stared at her lord. My lord, what did you just say? Did I not make it clear enough? Let them come in and see me. But... Falern really wanted to say, but don't you usually refuse to see them? In fact, this was the source of her anger. It was not the first day that the southern nobles' hearts were shaken. In fact, they had wanted to negotiate with Brando more than once, but Brando had never cared about it. He did not even bother to restrain these people. He even gave them the excuse of not causing too much chaos in Fathom Harbor. Falerne originally thought that today would be the same way, but she did not expect that her lord, who did whatever he wanted, would suddenly have a sudden impulse to see these people again. In fact, in Falerne's opinion, what was there to see? The best way to deal with them was to capture the few who caused the most trouble and kill the chicken to warn the monkey. With how cowardly these people were, they wouldn't be able to cause any trouble. Falerne could not help but look at the lord in front of her suspiciously. Brando waved his hand and said, "No buts. Go and see the guest who arrived at the castle yesterday." That guest? Falerne was stunned for a moment before she remembered that person. He seemed to be from the northern region of Ludwig. From his appearance she could tell that he was from Cruz, but he had a strong Fanzan bloodline. In short, he was a mixed blood. When he arrived at the castle, he claimed to be a messenger from the Black Legion. He was wearing a thick cloak that covered most of his face, as if he didn't dare to meet anyone. However, Falerne remembered that her lord had received him very seriously. Falerne was not a gossipy woman. When she heard Brando's order, she just nodded silently and was about to turn around and leave. However, at this time Brando called her again. "Wait," Brando said. "I called you in just now, not specifically for you to deal with these nobles." "What do you mean?" Falerne turned around and asked. Brando knocked on his forehead and seemed to think for a moment before replying. "Just right, I can do two things at the same time. Contact the county and tell him to come to me immediately. Can you find him now? Tell him that I want to see Amandina now immediately." Falerne nodded silently. "AB's territory, Valhalla Fortress." "Miss Shido, Your Highness the Crown Prince." Amandina saw the Crown Prince and Miss Scholar coming out of the hall and stood up to bow. Behind the Crown Prince were the youths of the Folded Sword Knight, who were under house arrest a few months ago. There were more than 10 people in the group, all of them fully armed and ready to fight. These young nobles of Cruz seemed to have calmed down after a few months of tempering. But perhaps it was because they were used to staying in Valhalla. These proud youths of the Empire did not need to condescend to the lord of a small place. But for a lord like Brando who owned a fantasy fortress like Valhalla, they might not really see him as a mere Count of Erewhon. In fact, after a few months of getting along, they at least had a general understanding of Brando's strength. Even if it was only on the surface, it was enough to make people respect him. Even those powerful counts in the Empire might not be able to match up to such a small Count of Erewhon. Along with this, they also respected Brando's assistant, or rather assistant, Amandina. But that was it. Even in front of the real royal family of Erewhon, it would be difficult for these youths to show such a respectful attitude. After all, it was just the royal family of a small kingdom. Small countries like Erewhon had many vassal states on the border of the empire. But the crown prince himself, Lenoret, was still the same as a few months ago. He seemed a little taciturn and rarely talked to outsiders. In response to Amandina's salute, he just nodded slightly. He frowned slightly, as if he was thinking about some difficult problem at any time. The light in his eyes was also unfathomable. He did not speak, but Miss Scholar Shido beside him had already spoken on his behalf. "Miss Amandina, is there something important that you suddenly called us for? Has the situation in the Empire changed again?" Amandina silently looked at these Cruz people and nodded. "There are some changes, but this is not the main purpose of today." She paused for a moment and said, "General Mangrove has contacted my lord." Oh! This sentence seemed to ignite the wildness in Lenoret's heart. The crown prince raised his head at once, and his slightly deep eyes lit up. "It's time." Chapter 991. The crystal ball seemed to be suspended in the darkness, and the flowing light reflected half of the woman's thin face. Her cheeks were deeply sunken, and her face was pale like a ghost. The woman pursed her lips tightly, and her terrifyingly thin lips seemed to be cut open by a knife on her dry skin. The shadow of the embroidered hood covered her eyes, and her sunken eyes emitted a faint light like a cat's in the darkness. She was expressionless. Soon, another face appeared in the darkness opposite her. It was also a woman's face, but it was a plump woman's face. The woman slowly walked out of the darkness with a sweet smile on her face. She squinted her eyes and greeted with a smile. I'm sorry, but I'm sorry, but I'm sorry. Long time no see, Krull. Only a sparkling crystal ball was left between the two of them, emitting a strange brilliance. The light dissipated in all directions and gradually merged into the darkness. The silence only lasted for a moment. Probably guessing that the other party wouldn't answer her, Anwei smiled. You know, I'm waiting for your answer. The secret can't always be hidden in the forest, and the magic moon will rise one day. What answer, Anwei? Krull raised his head, and his empty eyes were like two whirlpools, eyes of insight. The witches of her race could see through the vortexes and traps in time during divination, and could clearly see the riddles of the future and the past. However, only the inheritor of the Sword of the Moon had the eyes that could truly dispel the fog. It was said that this pair of eyes was taken from the giant snake Kukulal, and had the ability to see the future. The witch's voice seemed to come from the abyss of hell, and it was so gloomy that it made one shiver. You already know the answer to this question. The plump woman frowned. Why are you so stubborn? This isn't your character. You know that the loyalty of mortals has no binding force on us. We witches are loyal to the true master, the dark dragon, Odin, the ruler of the Myrna people, and the leader of the army. Now the moon has returned to this land. She has returned, and the Liamen, cave dwellers, harpies, mountain people, werewolves, and even the Myrna people worship her as their master. You know, the shadow of the dragon who knows everything has descended on this land. She is the person destined to be in the past, present, and future. The witch queen has already prophesied this. Why don't you turn back and be with me? Krull didn't say a word, but after a while, Anwei noticed that she was sneering. What are you laughing at? There was still a deathly silence in the darkness. Anwei's frown deepened. She had known Krull for many years and knew his temperament well. The witches of the Moon of Swords inherited the power of Hati's sixth daughter, the beautiful Tadessa. The beautiful Tadessa grasped the domain of peace and communication. Therefore, the witches of the Moon of Swords were also known as the witches of darkness. They were blind walkers in the darkness and possessed the power to communicate with the mysteries and spirits. They obtained inspiration from those whispers and made keen predictions. Therefore, the more this woman in front of her remained silent, the more anxious Anwei felt. Babasha lied to us, Krull. That young man isn't the darkness dragon. Do you know, I heard some rumors? In the Great Glacier, some ancient ghosts are awakening. None of this points to that prophecy. I received a revelation from the Seven Dragon King. She was once the strongest ally of the darkness dragon. Krull, why aren't you talking? Answer me. There were rarely fierce disputes between the witches. Their mortal enemies would often use even more evil and cruel methods to deal with their opponents. It was just like the witches' motto, start by killing, end by killing. The magic of darkness had long eroded their hearts. They were cold, heartless, and indifferent to life, but they often didn't need meaningless quarrels. But today was clearly an exception. Even the dark space seemed to have sensed the tit-for-tat between the two witches. The gentle light emitted by the crystal ball had unknowingly become sharp. Krull's complexion appeared even paler under the dazzling white light. Her lips moved. Leave, Anwei. Fate has already been decided. You chose to stay. Anwei sucked in a breath of cold air. I thought you were just waiting for an opportunity. She still wanted to say something, but her voice had already become distorted. The crystal ball floating in midair seemed to have suddenly extracted the surrounding time and space. Even the flowing light was bent, forming a vortex that sucked in the darkness from all directions. Anwei revealed an expression of shock and anger. Her face was extremely distorted under such a strange situation. She let out a screech that changed the pitch of her voice. This is a dream. You actually dare to peep into my dream, Krull. How dare you? Her voice came to an abrupt end. When the light of the crystal ball was distorted to the extreme, the entire pitch-black space shattered into pieces. Anwei exploded like glass and then dissipated into the darkness. After an unknown amount of time, the thin woman opened her eyes again. Her forehead was covered in fine beads of sweat. She was in a small tent with Babasha and the sugar jar beside her. What did you see? Sugar jar hugged her seemingly inexhaustible candy jar and looked curiously at the mysterious woman. A dream about the future. Krull replied expressionlessly. You saw Onway. That fat woman must be furious. Sugarjar laughed. But I'm a little curious. Krull, you have the eyes of insight. What exactly did you see and why did you choose to stand on our side? That's naturally because Sir is the true darkness dragon. Babasha at the side had a look of reverence. Lady Krull is the most outstanding prophet among the witches. Even she stands on Sir's side. This means that fate has already made a choice. That's not necessarily true, Babasha. Sugarjar didn't seem to mind that her subordinates didn't agree with her view at all. She said with a smile, I heard that the most outstanding prophets among the witches are the witches from the Moon of Harp and the Moon of Heresy. The witches from the Moon of Harp control the power of Ekka's third daughter, Misha, and are in charge of the power of prophecy and charm. The witches of fate are the favorites of fate. The witches from the Moon of Heresy are believers of Timmy's. Their power has the true ability of insight. Compared to the dark witches who have mastered communication, they are probably even better in the path of prophecy. Now the witches from the Moon of Harp have yet to appear, but Timmy's witch Roya has already stood on the side of the Silver Queen. From this, it can be seen that it's hard to say whether our Sir is the Darkness Dragon or not. At least I don't think he's the Darkness Dragon. But he's more interesting. I like him more. I don't want to be on the side of that old woman. As a witch from a branch family, Babasha naturally didn't understand the inheritance of the witches as well as Sugarjar. When she heard the words of her own family's inheritor, she became a little worried for a while. Previously, she had discovered Brando's potential and introduced this young man to Sugarjar and Kuril. But if Brando wasn't the Darkness Dragon, wouldn't she have committed a grave mistake? As for the disrespectful words about the Darkness Dragon from Sugarjar's mouth, this old witch pretended not to hear them. Kuril, on the other hand, didn't seem to hear the conversation between the two generations of witches. He just sat there silently like a piece of rotten wood. Sugarjar noticed her attitude and was a little dissatisfied. Kuril, you haven't answered my question. Kuril glanced at the little girl and was silent for a moment before answering. Onway is the maid of the Witch King. I already knew this. Sugarjar had a disapproving look. What kind of answer is this? Kuril paused for a moment. She's an Erewhon. Although she didn't say who she was, Sugarjar seemed to understand and jumped up like a cat whose tail was stepped on. What? I met her a few years ago. She brought a little girl with her. That little girl has a name, Sophia. She paused for a moment. It's not a changed name, it's her real name. The 13th month. Sugarjar sucked in a breath of cold air. 16. The tower. The lost moon took away the light. The hall was filled with buzzing sounds. The crowd was clearly divided into two sides. The two sides had been confronting each other in the hall for a long time. One side was well dressed. They were the Cruz nobles who had been exiled from the south. The other side was wearing sky blue battle robes and the standard armor of the White Lion Legion. They were the Erewhon people who came with the fleet. To be exact, they were the Erewhon soldiers. Although the nobles enjoyed the advantage of status, the weapons in the hands of the young soldiers of Erewhon didn't seem inferior in the slightest. It was enough to make these people stop obediently. They only dared to glare or curse in a low voice. Ask your lord to come out. This is the territory of the Cruz people. It's not a place where you Erewhon people can behave atrociously. How long does he plan to deceive us? This is the war of the Cruz people. You are not welcome here. Such noises came in waves. It looked like a scene often seen in the noble parliament of Cruz or Erewhon. Perhaps in normal times, the nobles with a little bit of status wouldn't roll up their sleeves and do such things in person. But today was different. Their servants were either arrested by Brando or forcibly incorporated into the local garrison, controlled by the Erewhon people. If they didn't do it in person, perhaps no one would do it for them. But among the crowd, there were still a few people with high status. To be exact, there were 5 people. 5 nobles elected representatives to negotiate with Brando. They were Earl Alcorn, Earl Jean, Sir Foss, Baron Tyrion, and Knight Rogers. Of course, the internal court Knight Rogers was only chosen to make up the numbers. These internal court knights were usually closer to Brando's group, so the nobles hoped that they could play a more important role at this time. At least, they could represent the nobles of Cruz to say a few words of justice in front of these damn Erewhon people. But compared to the excited nobles, these 5 people were more calm. Earl Alcorn and his colleagues looked at each other. Looking at the scene in front of them, their faces didn't look too optimistic. Compared to these nobles who basically didn't have any dealings with Brando, they knew the young lord's temper better. Although he seemed to not care about anything and was easier to talk to, they knew that his personality was probably much tougher than everyone imagined. Besides, they should have been driven away by these guards. Now in this port, although they were still nominally managers, almost all the troops in the port were under the control of Erewhon people. In fact, they were just a group of puppets with no right to speak at all. But today the other party was indifferent, as if he was letting them do whatever they wanted. Whether it was Earl Alcorn or the other nobles, they faintly smelled the scent of a conspiracy. But at this moment they were already in a difficult situation. Except for Knight Rogers, who was forcibly dragged here and could still look on coldly, the other nobles' foreheads were faintly sweating. Although the other nobles next to them were enthusiastic, the 4 noble representatives in the middle had been staring at the door on the 2nd floor of the hall. They knew that if Brando wanted to send a message, it would be difficult for someone to come out from there soon. Sure enough, with a click, the door was pushed open. The sound of the door opening seemed to be a signal, and the whole hall was silent. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads, and countless eyes gathered on the door. Oh! Chapter 992. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the door on the 2nd floor slowly opened. However, the one who walked out from behind the door was not Brando or his attendant as the nobles had imagined. Instead, it was a trembling nobleman in a noble's robe. His hair was gray, and his face was full of wrinkles and age spots. Everyone was stunned because this man was the castellan of Metz City, Baron Ludwig Metz. In the silence, the Baron slowly walked to the handrail and glanced at the crowd with a dignified look. His eyes only paused for a moment on Count Alcorn and the others. Then he said, "I welcome all of you to my territory as guests. I have also heard about what happened in the south. I am deeply sorry for that. But why have all of you gathered in my castle today?" There was dead silence. The nobles downstairs couldn't help but look at each other. They thought that this old man was under house arrest. Why would he suddenly appear in this place? Could it be that he was pressured to speak, and the other party wanted to use this opportunity to force them to leave? This method was too hateful. For a moment there was silence downstairs. Everyone wanted to wait for the nobles to speak, but Count Alcorn and the other 4 did not speak for a long time. Finally, an impatient noble stood up and said, "Lord Baron, please ask Erewhon's Count Abes to come out. We are here to look for him." "The leader of Erewhon's diplomatic group is my distinguished guest. Why are you looking for him?" the Baron asked. Oh no! Count Alcorn's heart sank. The feeling of a conspiracy in his heart became more and more obvious. He looked back and saw that the people around him had the same expression. However, at this time it was too late for him to stop his men from speaking. The noble who spoke at the beginning replied loudly, "Lord Baron, you don't have to worry about the threat of the person behind you. We are here today to ask him to come out and clean up the situation. Now that the situation is clear, Erewhon's people wouldn't want to occupy your port, would they?" "Shut up." Baron Metz's face suddenly sank. His voice was so cold that it was like a layer of frost. The people downstairs felt a chill in their hearts. Of course, this did not mean that Baron Metz's status was the highest among them. It was just that he was the owner of this place and had the geographical advantage. Naturally, he had the upper hand. "I am the castellan of Fathom Port. Naturally, I am in charge of everything here. You are my guests. Erewhon's diplomatic group is also my guests. I hope that all of you will not cause trouble here to ruin the image of the Empire's nobles." These words left everyone dumbfounded and unable to find a reason to refute. Of course, logically speaking, there was no flaw in these words, but everyone knew that Ludwig Metz was no longer a city lord and was at most a puppet. However, these words couldn't be said in public. For a moment, the expressions of all the nobles were incomparably strange, as though they were constipated. Sure enough, Count Alcorn's face sank. He had already expected that Brando would not be so easy to talk to. Now that he had slapped him in the face, it was within his expectations. He did not know why, but he felt relieved. The fact that Brando let Baron Metz out meant that there was still room for negotiation in his heart. At least he did not intend to make things too awkward. He then frowned again. But this kind of trick was after all a small trick. If Brando did not want to see them, he could have just driven them away. There was no need for him to play this kind of trick. Although small tricks could fool people for a while, at this time it would only make people look down on him. Or did the young man have other intentions? But no matter what, Baron Metz's words had blocked the room for others to speak. Count Alcorn knew that he had to speak up. He pondered for a moment, then raised his head and said, "Mr. Baron, no matter what, being trapped here is not a solution. We can't stay here forever. We have to come up with a solution. Right now, the situation in the Empire is chaotic. His Majesty and the rebels are fighting in the area of Zweig. Jorgendy Ridge and Lord Lyon's army have been summoned by our Emperor and changed sides. Now the White Legion has entered Geta Harbor, which is only 3 days away from Fathan. If we don't make a decision, we might be seen as part of the rebels." As soon as Count Alcorn finished speaking, he suddenly realized that something was wrong. He suddenly remembered that Baron Metz was Duke Rena's vassal. Now that the Duke was clearly on the side of the military nobles, wouldn't the former's position be self-evident? Sure enough, before he could change his words, Baron Metz interrupted him lightly. "I agree with most of what you said, Count Alcorn, but I have reservations about some of them. Constance colluded with the evil dragon to kill her father to ascend the throne. She also tried to attack the princes in an attempt to overthrow the empire. I doubt that such a vicious woman can still be called His Majesty the Emperor of the Empire." This sentence was like a heavy bomb falling into the water, immediately stirring up thousands of waves. The nobles were in an uproar, whether it was the words from Baron Metz's mouth or Baron Metz's audacious behavior. But this time, Count Alcorn was not in the mood to restrain his men. He felt sweat on his forehead. He did not expect the Baron, who was as old as an old dog, to be so fierce. As soon as he opened his mouth, he forced his men into a desperate situation. Count Alcorn almost wanted to reach out his hand to wipe the sweat off his forehead. After calming down, he sighed and said, "My lord, please watch your words." Count Alcorn sighed and said, "Count Alcorn, please pay attention to your words." "What, Count Alcorn, you don't believe my words?" Baron Metz sneered. "Of course, there may be some rumors that are unfavorable to Her Majesty the Queen, but that's just the enemy's way of deceiving the world. It's not worth mentioning." Count Alcorn's words suddenly came to an abrupt halt. He suddenly realized that the city lord in front of him did not seem to be forced by Brendel. If the other party was just a puppet, then there was no need for him to go to this extent just because of a verbal dispute. He suddenly thought of a terrible possibility. The cold sweat on his forehead could no longer be stopped. He suddenly raised his head and looked at Baron Metz. He realized that he might have been fooled. "Count Alcorn, it seems that you intend to stand on the opposite side of the empire." "I." Even though Count Alcorn's position in the empire was slightly higher than Baron Metz's, he could not speak at this moment. At this time, the others in the hall saw that the situation was not right. For a moment they chose to keep quiet to protect themselves. Even Count Jean, who was next to Count Alcorn, was cautious and did not say a word. Roger raised his head. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that the corners of the second floor of the hall were already filled with heavily armored knights. The battle robes on these knights were clearly the style of the Cruz Empire. Obviously, they were not the army of Erewhon. The internal knight raised his eyebrows and immediately lowered his head. He did not say anything. Count Alcorn finally wiped his sweat and asked, "Mr. Baron, what do you mean by this?" "That's what I mean." A man's voice sounded from behind Baron Metz. All the nobles present saw Baron Metz respectfully step back and let the man come to the front. In fact, Count Alcorn did not even need to see the man's face. Just by hearing his voice, his face had already changed. He raised his head in disbelief and sure enough, he saw that handsome, cold face appear in his field of vision. At this moment, Count Alcorn's expression was extremely strange, but fortunately, no one could laugh at his ridiculous expression because the dozens of faces in the hall were surprisingly the same. When they saw the young man appear from behind Baron Metz, many people even let out a slight gasp. Your Royal Highness? Why, is it strange to see me?" Prince Lenneret's face was cold. "Or is it because you received my obituary in advance and now suspect that I'm a fake?" "No. I wouldn't dare." Well, then I want to tell you a piece of news. My mother has harmed all for one, and now they are colluding with the Myrnas to subvert the empire and persecute my brothers and sisters. I now ask all the nobles of the entire empire to listen to my call and join the army to save the empire from its collapse. Leneret didn't seem to be informing them of the news, but more like giving an order. He didn't even need to get any approval. It was as if he was simply stating his position. Do you understand? Oui. Count Alcorn was still pondering over the word, but the eldest prince didn't seem to need their answer at all. He directly pointed with his finger. Count Alcorn, Count Jean, and my internal knight, come up to see me. The rest of you disperse. Will these people be obedient? Just as the eldest prince was showing his power, Roman, Brando, and Falerne were actually standing in the hall on the second floor, watching the farce not far away, and the merchant girl asked curiously. Brando shook his head silently. That's the cruise people's business. He paused and added. There are many forces within the empire. In fact, the Silver Queen only controls the nobles of Cloak Bay, which means that only the White Legion and a part of the Imperial Navy are truly loyal to her. Even the Red Legion has to be greatly discounted. Otherwise, the Wind Elves have stopped fighting for a few weeks, and they didn't have the slightest reaction in the Four-Leaf Clover Plains. As for the rest of the mountain people in Senia, they are all ethnic minorities within the empire. Since they are called ethnic minorities, as the name implies, there won't be too many people and even fewer troops. Compared with the several main legions of the empire, they are not worth mentioning at all. The remaining witches and Myrnas are not even a fraction of the total. The empire is a huge monster, and these forces may be strong in the hands of a lord, but in the empire they are nothing. At least, they can't determine the strength of the empire. I understand now, Romain said in realization. The reason why the nobles of Ludwig keep retreating is because they're all in a state of disunity. They're all fighting for themselves and have their own plans. It's like a business investment that doesn't have a clear goal and is fickle. Naturally, it'll lead to failure. Smart, Brando praised and patted Roman's forehead, causing the latter to glare back at him. He smiled and said, there are many rebels in the empire, and the number of people loyal to the Holy Cathedral of Fire is much more than you think. It's just that these forces are too scattered, and any one of them will not be a match for Her Majesty. Everyone has the idea of protecting themselves, and this is not surprising. In the case of absolute strength, except for a few extreme cases, no one will choose to die in vain. But if the strength is not as great as you think, then it's different. Now that we have a common interest to rely on, it's different. A common interest to rely on? Falerne looked at Brando strangely. My lord, are you talking about the eldest son of the emperor? Brando chuckled. I've said it before. This person is a rare commodity. Brando, when did you say that? Romain raised her eyebrows curiously. Of course I did. Why else would I keep him here? Now that his bluff was exposed, the young count couldn't help but feel a little angry. You should know that at that time, it wasn't easy for me to hide the whereabouts of the next successor of the empire. Furthermore, it was a huge political and diplomatic risk. If it weren't for today's benefits, how could I have convinced our stubborn princess? Out of his familiarity with Brando's character, the Roman looked at him suspiciously, but Falerne seemed to believe him. The wild elf girl frowned slightly. The forces in the Cruz Empire are intricate and complicated. Which ones are loyal to the Silver Queen, and which ones are loyal to the eldest son of the emperor? What are their relationships? My lord, have you investigated all of this? Of course, Brando sighed. The Cruz Empire is too close to us and the empire is too strong. We cannot understand ourselves, but we must understand the empire. Falerne was silent. She was born in Eloranta, a place that stood aloof from worldly affairs. Later on, like many other wild elves, she traveled to White City with her younger sister. There, she joined a mercenary group and became a mercenary wizard. The 10 Cities area was also filled with various forces, and the city-states were often at odds with each other. However, as a mercenary, she often did not need to consider so many things. It was also difficult for her to experience the feeling of treading on thin ice all day long. It was only at this moment that she seemed to have a new understanding of the young lord beside her. She could not help but frown and look at the latter with a very complicated expression. Unfortunately, Brando didn't notice the expression of his private secretary at all. At this moment he thought of Erwin, Abies, and the vast black forest. One day, Erwin would no longer need to rely on the breath of others to survive. At that time, Erwin would also have a vast territory and powerful strength. Erwin's people would no longer need to guess the thoughts of others to live. They would also be fierce lions standing proudly on this land. Perhaps only at that time, the wishes of the eldest princess and the Valkyrie would be fulfilled. Brando suddenly remembered the princess and the Valkyrie in the game. They were very different from the Griffine and Freya of today. The environment and suffering had changed them, but today's Erwin no longer needed that princess and the Valkyrie. Because Erwin no longer needed people, its people cried silently for it. When he came back to his senses, the conversation in the hall was coming to an end. "What did you see, Falerne?" Brando suddenly turned around and asked. Falerne was slightly startled, as if she had just woken up from something. She blushed and hurriedly shook her head. "What did you see? Count Alcon didn't come here voluntarily. He is the leader of the nobles. If he didn't have the intention to encourage these people, what does that mean?" Brando sneered. "I was a little curious. I thought that the nobles in Loneport had been taught a deep enough lesson. They shouldn't have forgotten the pain so quickly. Now that I think about it, I shouldn't have missed anything. It's just that there's another reason behind it." Falerne frowned slightly. If she still couldn't understand the hidden meaning in her lord's words, then her position as the lord's secretary would be in vain. "My lord, are you saying that someone is instigating these nobles behind their backs? Who is it?" "I didn't know," Brando replied coldly. "But unfortunately, some people were too anxious and exposed their foxtail." "Exposed their foxtail," the Roman chuckled. "This description is very appropriate." Oh. Chapter 993. Anwei let out a scream and immediately woke up from her meditation. The meditation of a witch was very different from that of a wizard. A wizard's law magic required them to use their law threads to restrain the manic magic in order to prepare a day's worth of spells. This was a dangerous job, so they needed sufficient rest and a quiet environment. However, the power of the witches came from the projection of magic in Wonde, the 12 magic moons. There were 13, including the Black Moon. The first generation of witches had built a kingdom of witches in this shadow world, the Bunasan. This was a kingdom where pure magic and the spiritual world intertwined. It did not exist in the material world, but every witch had to immerse their spirit in it. During the day they were active in the real world. During the night, they would enter the kingdom of witches from their dreams, and communicate in whispers in the spiritual world. However, the shadow world was even more absurd and dangerous than the real world. In the world of dreams, the slightest carelessness would cause one's spirit to be lost in the depths of the darkness. Thus, the witches would carefully guard their own domain, and use meditation to calm themselves. This was an important ritual that could not be failed. Once it failed, the consequences would be very severe. Very serious. Curel. The witch let out an unforgettable cry of anger. "You deserve to die." A few young witches rushed in from outside the tent and looked at the disheveled Anwei in panic. Anwei pointed at them and sternly said, "Quick, kill that cat." Outside the tent, there was a curved maple frame with a golden cage hanging from it. Inside the cage was a black cat. At this moment, the black cat was restlessly circling the golden cage with its back hunched. All the hair on its back stood on end. Its green eyes stared at the corner of the tent as it bared its fangs and continuously let out mournful screams. In Wonde, people believed that cats were the incarnations of witches. In some places, cats were burned alive, and the black cat, which was regarded as unlucky, was even more difficult to escape. Hatred and cruelty towards cats also appeared in legends from time to time. In a sense, this saying was not wrong. Witches used cats as their incarnations when they encountered something they could not escape from in the shadow world. When they were in danger, they would use cats to replace themselves. But at this moment, Anwei seemed as if she'd seen a venomous snake when she saw the black cat. The young witch then pulled out a shiny knife and stabbed it into the black cat's body. The black cat let out a strange scream and fell into a pool of blood. The young witch then stabbed the cat an inch behind its right front foot. The bottom of the cage was now covered with sticky blood. The other two young witches immediately drew shadows on the ground. The obscure characters began to perform the dream-devouring technique. Although the witches in the witch country of Bunasan could communicate with each other mentally, they would rarely allow others to enter their own domain. The world of shadows was vast and boundless. If not for the invitation of their master, others would rarely dare to walk through the world of traps and enter the dreams of others. But there is one exception, and that is the shadow world. The natives of the shadow were spirits born in the darkness. The witches of the Moon of Swords were in charge of communication and peaceful domains. And Wei was shocked and angry. Kuro must have communicated with the spirit in the darkness and found her location. The dream-devouring technique could devour dreams. The witches' meditation was carried out in their dreams, and to invade their domain, one would also need to enter the dream world. Therefore, the dream-devouring technique was the best defensive spell. The young witches nimbly set up the ritual. Obviously, this was not the first time they had done this. However, before they could chant the first incantation, the dim space around the tent suddenly lit up. A bright spot of light fell from the sky, like a stone falling into the water. With the landing point as the center, circles of circular patterns rippled out. A dazzling light seeped out from the center of the circular patterns. The light spot immediately spread into a spot of light. The spot of light gradually grew larger, forming a stable light door. Wei and the other young witches subconsciously stopped what they were doing. This wasn't a witch's method, but a supernatural power. Among the things that the witches were most familiar with, there was only one thing that possessed such power. And that was the spirit. The contract spirit, White Mist, casually opened a passage to reality through the shadow world. This action was so familiar to her, as if it had already formed a fixed memory of her body thousands of years ago. She leaped through the light door, drawing a beautiful arc as she landed on the ground. The moment she entered the material world, she turned back into a white fox. Raising her head, she used her beautiful ruby eyes to stare at the few people in front of her, and Wei and the few young witches beside her. Behind her were Babasha and the smiling sweets. The smiling little girl hugged her sweets and jumped through the light door, stopping behind White Mist. The Shire followed. The Shire brought 3 people and rolled out 3 times. The young people in red-lined magus robes strolled out of the light door unhurriedly. Last was the dark witch of the Moon of Swords, Krull. Krull was a little weak at the moment. Her steps were light, and her complexion was not much better than Wei's, who had been severely injured by her in the dream world. Wei's eyes widened, but she did not harshly question Krull why she wanted to harm her. She did not even make a sound. This chubby, round-faced witch's gaze was fixed on White Mist, as if she had seen some terrifying creature. This was not the first time she had seen White Mist. White Mist usually hung on her neck like a scarf. On the neck of the young lord's little fiancé, it was really hard not to notice it. Normally it would definitely not be like today, emitting the aura of a powerful spirit. This kind of aura was usually only sensed by witches, and witches were also the most sensitive to it. Wei could clearly feel it from the spirit in front of her. She sensed some aura that she had not felt for a long time. That kind of aura almost made her think that she was hallucinating. She felt the aura of her ancestors. The first generation of witches had merged their souls into the shadow world and constructed the Bunasan Witch Kingdom. Their souls wandered in the desolate shadows and became the most powerful spirits in the dark world. However, ever since the witch race had been completely defeated in the War of the Holy Saints and even split up, the Bunasan Witch Kingdom had been severely injured. These most powerful spirits no longer appeared in the world, and no witch had ever summoned them again. All the witches thought that they had already dissipated, just like the most precious inheritances of the witches. They had also dissipated in the fragmented spiritual world. In the middle. You. Who exactly are you? Wei pointed at White Mist and asked with a trembling voice. White Mist snorted and turned her head away in disdain. She was too lazy to answer this low-level witch's question. Although Wei was an inheritor of the Moon of Swords, inheritances were also divided into different grades and grades. Compared to the 12 inheritors that followed the Witch Queen during the heyday of the Witch Kingdom, this chubby woman in front of her was like a toddler learning how to walk. A little girl. She suddenly felt a little vexed. Even a minor character like this could see how powerful she was, but that young mistress didn't see her as a dish at all. Moreover, that young mistress was the inheritor chosen by the Witch Queen. This made her gnash her teeth in hatred. If it wasn't for, I would have eaten that little girl up. White Mist's mind was filled with such a dark and rebellious thought. White Mist didn't answer Wei's question, but it didn't mean that everyone else could. The Shire and the three youths behind him took a step forward and smiled amiably. Madam Wei, His Lordship has never forced you to do anything. Choosing to join His Lordship is also your own choice. Of course we welcome it. If you have to choose. If you want to leave, we won't stop you. That's your freedom. But don't you think it's despicable to play some dirty tricks behind our backs? Put away that hypocritical face of yours. Wei looked hatefully at Krull and said without the slightest bit of luck, I have never joined you, let alone any betrayal. I know. The Shire nodded. Because madam, you are the maid of the Witch Queen, right? It's good that you know, Wei replied coldly. Your lordship isn't the darkness dragon at all. Only an ignorant person like Babasha would be bewitched by others to believe in such a ridiculous rumor. My master has long predicted the arrival of my queen. There will only ever be one queen, and she has already come to this world. Yet you don't bow down to her? You are a subject and still intend to resist stubbornly. What a joke. She turned her head and stared at Krull. What I don't understand the most is you, Krull. You clearly know that young man isn't the darkness dragon, so why are you still so obstinate? You even don't hesitate to use such a forbidden technique. What exactly are you doing this for? Krull slowly raised her head and stared coldly at her colleague. Her face was deathly pale as if she was a dead person, but she opened her mouth. Brando isn't the darkness dragon. This was a definite tone. Wei's eyes widened. You know? Since you know, then why did you? She seemed to have seen something extremely unbelievable, to the extent that her voice became distorted. You actually chose to betray him? This is impossible. It's impossible for witches to betray their master. You are simply crazy. She let out a few screams and suddenly bounced up from the ground. She stretched out her hand to grab the Shire. A gust of chilly wind mixed with a terrifying whistle blew out from between her fingers and blew towards the Shire. Although Wei seemed to have gone crazy, she knew very clearly that among these people, the one who posed the greatest threat to her was actually these four humans. Wizards. Among all the spellcasting professions in Wond, there were two professions that were most proficient in combat. The first was the elementalist. Due to the great power of elemental magic, most of it was offensive magic. The second was the law wizard. Although law wizards sounded like the best candidates for scholars, and most of the scholars indeed knew one or two law spells, law wizards were also known as civilian wizards at the same time. They had the largest population of law wizards among all the spellcasters in Wond. If you randomly picked one or two spellcasters from the adventurer groups and mercenary groups, they would most likely be law wizards. From this, it could be seen that the large population of law wizards gave birth to a large number of law wizards who had extremely rich combat experience. These wizards passed on their experiences from generation to generation, and as time passed, a unique cultural atmosphere was formed among the law wizards. That was, combat was the only criterion to determine whether a wizard was qualified or not. Under such a cultural atmosphere, if a law wizard did not want to become a spellcasting profession that was proficient in combat, it would be difficult. The wizards under Brendel's command were mostly adventurers and mercenaries, and very few of them were scholars. Seal himself had experienced the last Holy War, and the wizards he chose were mostly adventurers and mercenaries. There were very few of them who were scholars. As for the wizards, their combat experience could be imagined. In addition to the fact that law wizards were both offensive and defensive, law wizards were notoriously difficult to deal with in combat. Although the witch's rune magic was strange and powerful, it was more of a secret method. They did not have the advantage in a direct confrontation. Thus, Wei was very clear that if she wanted to win, she had to catch her opponent off guard and make the first move. The first thing she did was to cast the 5th circle Touch of Ice. In the 12-circle rune magic system, the 5th circle magic was not very powerful. Most witches who were at the peak of the silver level could cast it. However, this witchcraft was one of the rare direct attack witchcraft, and its effect was very practical. It was a spell that directly attacked the soul, and it could freeze the soul for a short period of time, and it could even kill opponents who were weaker in strength. Of course, Wei did not expect that she would be able to kill 4 law wizards who were at least at the 5th circle in a single attack, especially when she knew that the Shire was a great wizard mentor who was close to the elemental domain. She only hoped that this attack of hers would be able to obstruct her opponent for a short period of time. She would be able to calmly cast the following spell. The witches were experts in the study of souls, and their achievements in this area were on par with the necromancers who studied the art of summoning. On the other hand, law wizards were not very good at this, so Anwei believed that she had a high chance of succeeding. In fact, her attack was extremely fast, and with a claw, complicated magic runes appeared in her palms that were as pale as snow. She completed this spell in the blink of an eye, and her powerful strength could be seen clearly. The whistling icy wind swept towards the Shire. The Shire smiled faintly and chanted an incantation. In the name of law, I let the lines disperse and there will no longer be a medium in space. Although law wizards were not good at souls, they were good at magic. Any magic transmission in space required a medium, and even space itself was a type of law. This was also the most difficult part about law wizards. Their study of incantations was extremely profound, and the ability of a sage like dismantling an incantation was as common as eating a meal to them. It was a miraculous thing. Magic was only a profound knowledge in front of law wizards. It was not mysterious at all. Law wizards were opponents who understood spellcasters the best. The whistling icy wind that was enough to freeze everything seemed to have met an invisible wall in front of the Shire. It slowed down and finally stopped, turning into snow-white ice dust that dissipated into nothingness. Anwei was stunned. She had long known that law wizards were difficult to deal with, but she did not expect the Shire to be so powerful. She took a shaky step back and hesitated for a moment. This was because she realized that she could not find a way to deal with this young man in front of her, not to mention that there were 3 law wizards behind him who were equally difficult to deal with. The Shire seemed to have seen this witch's retreat. He smiled faintly and said, "Surrender yourself, Madame Anwei. Since I'm here, I can't let you escape. Moreover, I've always been a timid and cautious person, and I've even brought 3 assistants with me." He spread out his hands. "My lord is not a bloodthirsty person. As I said, you are free to come and go. However, the current situation is not very suitable. As long as you are willing to work here for a while, we won't make things difficult for you." "You intend to put me under house arrest?" Anwei narrowed her eyes somewhat dangerously. Oh. Chapter 994. In the hall of the Valhalla tree, the hall was silent for a moment. Amandina slowly put down her hand, the prismatic crystal in her hand emitting a faint light. Amandina's eyes also emitted a faint light, but she did not say a word. The princess looked at her from the side and asked softly, "What's wrong? What did Count Tonajul say? The Empire? How is the situation over at Metz? Are the Count and the others doing well? Is the situation irreversible?" Amandina's eyes instantly regained clarity. She seemed to have come back to her senses and suddenly realized something. "What? No, it's nothing. The Lord and the others are doing well. There was a small accident, but the situation is still under control." She was silent. Brando rarely talked to her about her father, but just now he asked her about her father in a serious manner. "Amandina, there's something about your father that I want to talk to you about. Are you familiar with your father's life?" "Familiar? What I mean is, your father was a keen adventurer, but do you know where he went when he was alive? I mean, where are the strange places? Is this important, my lord?" "Very important. For now, Amandina, I suspect that your father's death is not that simple." Amandina's heart was in a mess. She silently clenched the crystal, the sharp point piercing her skin without feeling it at all. Her father's death might not be an accident, but a conspiracy. Conspiracy, this word jumped in her mind. Her childhood memories were very simple. At that time, she lived with her family in the Stone District. It was not a noble district at most. It was a place where the middle class of Brags lived. When she was a child, her family's life was quite good. It was a carefree time. Her father was a respected gentleman, and people called him Sir. According to her mother's description, their family was indeed considered noble. Their family had a glorious time, and their ancestors were once knights of the kingdom and had made outstanding achievements. But that was it. Her father was indeed a keen adventurer, and spent most of his time outside. He had been to many places, and Erwin had almost left his footprints everywhere. He even went abroad a few times, such as the Empire and the Duchy of Great Antler. But Amandina did not know the specific places he had been to. She remembered that her father loved to tell her stories of his travels when she was young, but out of a rebellious mentality, she did not deliberately record them. She only remembered that there was nothing too special about the places he went, what kind of beautiful scenery he saw, and a few times he encountered danger, but it was very normal. His father had a few friends, but most of them were not fixed. They were just traveling friends, so it was unlikely that they would fall into a trap. There was something special about her father. Amandina remembered that he seemed to be particularly interested in collecting stones from all over the world, from agate, obsidian, chalcedony, and all kinds of raw stones. He did not care about the value of the stones themselves, but was more interested in the process of them being buried underground and seeing the light of day. No one knows what kind of soul-stirring beauty is hidden in these ugly stones, Amandina. They may be worthless or they may be worth thousands of gold, but that is not important. What is important is that every stone that is buried deep underground has seen the light of day. They have witnessed a period of history, and compared to this long period of time, our lives are as short as an instant. She remembered that her father was a devout follower of the friars of Gaia. In addition to Martha, the friars also believed in Martha's follower, the goddess of earth Gaia. Her father was passionate about unearthing the gemstones buried deep in the earth to feel the history and emotions contained in the stones. Amandina suddenly remembered that one day, her father brought a gem that she had never seen before to her, and brought it over to her. Amandina, this stone is called amber. I found it in a strange place. Look at its beauty, but it is not just a gemstone. Amandina, do you know that there are many gemstones in this world that contain unimaginable magic, and amber is one of them? Magic? It is the driving force of our world. With it, people can use magic, soar in the sky, and even change this world. With it, I can become a wizard, father? No, Amandina. For wizards, magic is a privilege that only a few people have. But this stone is different. The people of Zell invented the Magitech, and this stone will eventually change our world. This is amber? Haha, this is an amber ore, Amandina. It's still far from being an amber ore, but it doesn't matter. These amber ores contain a great secret. It's like a key, and one day we'll be able to see the real amber ore, Amandina. Yes, father. It was as if a door had suddenly opened in the darkness, and the memories flowed out like a silent stream. Amandina slowly opened her palm and lowered her head. The diamond-shaped crystal shone in the dim light. This was a long-distance projection crystal made from mana moonstone. It was a true magic gemstone, but it was far less beautiful than the amber gemstone that her father gave her that afternoon many years ago. The magic gemstone was the crown of gemstones, and the amber gemstone was the brightest star on the crown. After that, her father began to become more and more obsessed with exploring, and the time he spent at home became less and less. Every time he would take a large sum of money from home, the neighbors whispered that her father had a mistress outside, and her mother became more and more depressed as the days passed. It was at that time that her impression of her father gradually changed. From the original respect to resentment to indifference, and finally she seemed to have forgotten his existence. Until Brando sent the news of his death to her. At that time, Amandina felt that she should not be surprised at all, because sometimes she could not help but wonder if her father had another woman outside. But at least Brando gave her a negative answer. At least he did not cheat them. But this was not a reason for her to forgive him. This stone is called amber. It will provide endless power for the Magitech. One day it will change our world. Amandina stood silently in place. A breeze blew in from outside the arched window of the Valhalla Tree Hall, rustling the blueprints on the desk. The afternoon sun poured into the hall, forming pillars of light. Princess Grafine looked at Amandina's face, and suddenly there were some sparkling things like a string of beads, sparkling and translucent. After a moment, Amandina took a deep breath, took a step back and wiped her eyes. I'm sorry, I forgot myself, Your Highness. I should be the one saying sorry. The princess looked at her with some confusion. What happened? Nothing, I just thought of my father. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Your Highness. Amandina smiled like a pear blossom in tears. The Lord asked us to be a little more vigilant during this period of time. The magic tide is coming, and there are many changes happening everywhere. Indeed, Grafine sighed. But what really makes me feel uneasy is something else. The undead are starting to become restless again. Amandina was about to leave, but when she heard this she stopped. Your Highness, the royal faction seems to be not right. Count Tanagel's reform has hurt the interests of the dukes, but our strength is far greater than theirs. There is no need to worry. Amandina seemed to be getting to know the princess again. What's wrong? Your Highness, I hope you will seriously consider what I told you last time. Princess Graffine's face was slightly red. I will seriously consider it. Amandina's father is a believer of the Gaia Friars? The light of the projection crystal flashed twice and then dimmed. Brando silently put down his hand and frowned. The Gaia Friars? Is there such a church in Erewhon and it's active near Braggs? Why haven't I heard of it before? There are many churches in Erewhon that believe in the goddess of Gaia, and the more famous ones are the Church of the Silver Lily and the Church of the Holy Cross, but I've never heard of an organization called the Gaia Friars. Is it some kind of cult? But it doesn't seem like it, and collecting stones isn't a shameful thing to do. Amandina's father found the amber stone in Yinbao, but what does the amber stone have to do with this thing? Brando took out the grayish-brown stone from his other pocket. This thing doesn't seem to have any relation to the amber stone, but it seems to be a fragment of some kind of shale. Did the amber rough stone contain a huge secret? Brando shook his head. It seems that Amandina's interest in magic devices originated from her father, but whether her father was only interested in the endless power provided by the magic gem, or whether he was pursuing some other secret, and the secret of the amber stone, only the heavens would know. If even Amandina doesn't know, then the only clues left would probably fall on her father's friends when he was alive, and that strange Gaia Friars. Amandina said that her father didn't have many friends when he was alive, and most of them weren't fixed. This doesn't sound like a problem, but it's a bit strange when you think about it. If her father was just a nobleman who was passionate about exploration, then it's fine, but he was also a devout believer of the Gaia Friars. Then the question is, where are his church members? Could it be that this Gaia Friars is similar to some of the strange hermit friars in Erewhon? Most of the church members don't know each other, and they don't interact with each other. Why did it sound like a cult? If there's something abnormal, then it's a demon. It seems that the clues will fall on this. He suddenly stopped. Brando. Romain was a little puzzled. He raised his head and furrowed his brows. His eyes swept across the area in front of him as if he was looking for something. One of his hands was on the collar of the Count's coat, while the other hand reached into the coat and grabbed the cold hilt of Halran Gaia. Falern's brows were furrowed as well. Her left hand was holding a large scroll of parchment, while her right hand reached out, and a silver cane appeared out of thin air and landed firmly in her hand. Dream manipulation? In front of him was an empty walkway. This walkway was connected to the hall in front of him, and it was brightly lit. Torches shone on the walls, but there wasn't a single person in the walkway, and it was strangely quiet. Count Brando, you're very sharp. A burst of laughter sounded. She clapped her hands lightly, and 4 white-robed witches suddenly appeared out of thin air. They suddenly appeared in the empty walkway, and blocked the way. The air between the 2 witches in front of him trembled slightly, and a beautiful witch slowly walked out. This was a beautiful and mysterious woman. She had a pair of impressive lake blue eyes, and the diamond-shaped crystal on her forehead shone with a strange light. She was also a witch. Marietla, eldest daughter of Ekis, believer of Dark Ko Hua, witch of the month of lies in December. The witch smiled slightly, and this smile made everything lose their color. She lightly opened her mouth and said, "Witch of deceit, I'm here to borrow Count Brando's head." "My lord." Brando stretched out his hand to stop Falern, who was about to attack, and motioned for her and Roman to step back. He raised his head and looked at the 5 witches. "I heard that among the 12 witches in this generation, besides the Witch King, the strongest one is the believer of the Golden Sea, the Witch of Despair. The second strongest one is the Witch of Deceit, Madame Marietla. I think you're her." As expected of a human who claims to be the inheritor of the Dark Dragon. "You know us quite well." Marietla praised with a smile. "Claim to be?" Brando shook his head. "I've never claimed to be the Dark Dragon. I've seen Odin, but that doesn't mean I agree with his views." "You've seen my king?" Marietla raised her eyebrows slightly and then reacted. Yes, after all, you have my king's inheritance in your body. But it doesn't matter whether you agree with my king's path or not. The Supreme doesn't need the approval of mortals. So you're saying that you're the ones behind this? Haha, Marietta laughed. The one who did it was Anvii. The witches of the Moon of Cup are good at changing people's hearts. Besides, those nobles have ulterior motives. My power comes from integrity and wisdom, so I don't care about these trivial matters. Playing with people's hearts is a small trick, but the order and fate of this world cannot be changed. Do you understand, Count? So you're an accomplice. Marietta frowned slightly and her voice turned cold. Do you understand the situation, Count? You've only just entered the elemental realm. In my domain, no one can save you. She turned her eyes to Roman and Falern and laughed. You're not counting on those people outside, are you? Don't worry, in this dream I've weaved for you. No one will be alerted. I'll let you die peacefully. I see, I think I understand. Brando pulled out Halrangaya, and his left hand passed to his right hand. The tip of the sword pointed downwards, gently touching the ground. He held the sword in one hand and grinned. My head is here, you can come and try. Oh,